Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity slows down a little, science stays approachable, and complex topics are explored in a way that lets your mind unwind rather than race. This space is meant to feel calm, steady and quietly interesting. A place where information flows without urgency, where you can listen closely or simply let the ideas drift past while you rest. Tonight's gentle exploration turns toward landscapes that many people overlook, sometimes avoid, and occasionally misunderstand. We're talking about swamps, wet ground, shallow water, dense vegetation, insects buzzing somewhere in the background, and a reputation that tends to lean toward murky, messy, or even slightly ominous. Yet beneath that reputation sits something far more intricate and surprisingly important. Something that often stays hidden under still water, tangled roots, and layers of soft sediment. Swamps exist on nearly every continent except Antarctica. They appear in warm tropical regions, temperate floodplains, coastal deltas, and slow river basins. Some stretch across thousands of square kilometres, while others are small pockets of wetland tucked between forests or grasslands. From a distance they can look quiet, even uneventful. Water may appear almost motionless. Vegetation grows thickly enough to block easy visibility. Sound travels differently there too, often softened by humidity and dense plant cover. Because of that, it can seem like nothing much is happening. That impression turns out to be misleading. Under the surface, swamps host constant activity. Microorganisms break down plant material hour by hour. Fish and amphibians move through submerged roots. Reptiles patrol slowly, sometimes visible only as ripples. Gases form in mud as organic matter decomposes. Plant roots compete for oxygen in saturated soil. Chemical reactions reshape nutrients in ways that influence nearby rivers, forests, and even the atmosphere. All of that continues whether anyone is watching or not. It is not dramatic in the way storms or fires are dramatic, but it is persistent and consequential. Before going further, a small moment of grounding, because this is usually where I like to connect this shared listening space with wherever you happen to be. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it in your part of the world right now? It is always interesting to imagine people scattered across different regions, some preparing for sleep, others just starting their day, all tuning into the same steady stream of information at slightly different points in their routine. That sense of quiet connection tends to fit well with topics like this, places that exist continuously whether visited or not. And if you find this style helpful for winding down, or if you simply enjoy calm explorations of science and nature, giving the video a like or subscribing helps this slow-paced corner reach more listeners. It supports the channel without changing the relaxed tone we keep here. No pressure, of course. The information still flows either way. Now, swamps often carry a reputation shaped more by storytelling than by direct experience. Films and books have long portrayed them as places of danger, mystery or decay. Mosquitoes, fog, hidden animals, sinking ground. Those elements do exist, but they are only a fraction of the reality. Scientists who study wetlands tend to describe them differently. They talk about biodiversity, water filtration, carbon storage, flood buffering, and habitat complexity. Those terms may sound technical, but they describe practical processes that affect everyday environments far beyond the swamp itself. Take water filtration as one example. When water flows into a swamp, whether from rainfall, rivers, or coastal tides, it slows down. Sediment settles. Plant roots absorb nutrients. Microbes transform certain pollutants. Over time, water leaving a swamp can be significantly cleaner than water entering it. This happens without machinery, without chemical plants, without direct human management. It is simply the result of biological and chemical processes unfolding steadily. Carbon storage is another less obvious function. Swamps accumulate plant material that decomposes slowly because of low oxygen conditions in saturated soil. That partially decomposed matter forms peat or organic mud. Carbon becomes locked in those layers rather than returning immediately to the atmosphere. On a global scale, wetlands hold vast carbon reserves. Disturbing them, through drainage or development, can release that stored carbon, which is one reason conservation groups pay close attention to these environments. Yet none of this is visible at a casual glance. From above, you might see water, plants, maybe a bird lifting off. The deeper processes stay concealed. That hidden quality is part of what makes swamps scientifically interesting. Surface calm does not equal inactivity. It often means processes are occurring gradually, without sudden visual cues. There is also the sensory experience of being physically present in a swamp, something that varies widely depending on region. Some tropical swamps feel warm, humid and loud with insect calls. Temperate swamps can be cooler, with seasonal changes altering water levels and vegetation density. Coastal mangrove swamps bring saltwater influence, distinctive root structures, and tidal rhythms. Freshwater forested swamps may feature cypress or tupelo trees rising directly from shallow water. Each variation produces its own patterns of wildlife, soil chemistry, and ecological interaction. Interestingly, human relationships with swamps have shifted over time. In earlier centuries, many societies viewed wetlands primarily as obstacles to agriculture or settlement. Drainage projects converted large areas into farmland or urban land. Only later did ecological research highlight the environmental services those wetlands provided. Today, restoration projects sometimes attempt to recreate lost swamps because of their role in flood control, biodiversity support, and climate regulation. That change in perspective reflects increasing awareness rather than a change in the swamps themselves. Another aspect worth noting is how difficult swamps can be to study compared to more open ecosystems. Dense vegetation, unstable footing, insects, and waterlogged conditions complicate long-term fieldwork. Equipment must withstand humidity and mud. Visibility underwater is often limited by suspended sediment. That means some processes remain less documented than those in forests, grasslands, or coral reefs. Scientific understanding continues to grow, but there are still gaps. Despite that, technology has helped. Remote sensing satellites monitor wetland extent. Water chemistry sensors track nutrient cycles. Acoustic monitoring captures animal calls even when visibility is poor. DNA sampling from water reveals species presence without direct observation. These methods allow researchers to build a clearer picture of what happens beneath the surface, even when direct access is challenging. Public perception, though, often lags behind research. Many people still associate swamps mainly with inconvenience or discomfort. Standing water suggests mosquitoes, mud suggests difficulty moving, dense vegetation suggests limited visibility. All true to some degree, yet those characteristics also create unique habitats. Species adapted to swamp conditions often cannot survive elsewhere. Amphibians rely on shallow water breeding grounds. Certain fish depend on low oxygen tolerance. Specialized plants evolve root systems capable of coping with saturated soil. Even smell, which some people notice immediately in wetlands, has scientific explanations. Decomposition under low oxygen produces gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. Those gases carry distinctive odors. Rather than indicating decay alone, they signal active biochemical cycles. Microbes breaking down organic matter play essential roles in nutrient recycling. Again, what seems unpleasant on the surface often reflects necessary ecological processes. Sound behaves differently in swamps as well. Dense vegetation absorbs and diffuses noise. Water surfaces reflect certain frequencies. Animal calls sometimes travel farther at night when temperature gradients stabilize air layers. If you have ever heard frogs calling across a wetland after sunset, that layered chorus results from many individuals spaced across shallow water, each using sound for territory and mating communication. It can feel loud up close yet oddly distant at the same time. Light penetration is another factor shaping what happens below the surface. Suspended particles, tannins from decaying leaves, and algae growth reduce visibility underwater, fish species adapt accordingly, relying more on lateral line sensing or low light vision. Predators often depend on stillness rather than speed. These adaptations illustrate how environmental constraints guide evolution over long periods. And then there is the simple physical stability of swamp ground, which is often less stable than it appears. Layers of peat or mud compress under weight. Water saturation reduces friction between particles. That does not necessarily make swamps dangerous, but it does mean movement requires awareness. Boardwalks and protected wetlands exist partly to protect both visitors and delicate soil structures. Heavy foot traffic can disrupt root systems and sediment layers. All of these details combine into a picture that is far more structured than the casual term swamp might suggest. Instead of chaotic wet ground, we find organised biological communities, chemical cycles, and physical dynamics interacting continuously. None of it dramatic in a cinematic sense, yet collectively significant. At this point, it becomes useful to slow down even further and look closely at the basic question underlying everything else. What actually qualifies an environment as a swamp in scientific terms, and how does that differ from marshes, bogs, or other wetlands? Those distinctions might sound technical, but they clarify why certain plants grow where they do, why certain animals appear in some wetlands but not others, and why conservation strategies vary from one region to another. And once that foundation is clear, the hidden layers beneath the water surface start to make more practical sense rather than seeming mysterious or undefined. So easing gently into that explanation helps set the stage for everything that follows. When people hear the word swamp, the first images that tend to come to mind are standing water, mud that looks difficult to walk through, buzzing insects, and thick vegetation that makes visibility limited. Those impressions are not entirely wrong, but they simplify something that scientists define with more precision. A swamp is a specific type of wetland characterized mainly by the presence of woody plants, usually trees or shrubs, growing in waterlogged soil for significant parts of the year. That single detail, the dominance of trees rather than grasses or mosses, is what separates swamps from other wetland categories like marshes or bogs. It sounds like a small distinction, but it has wide ecological consequences. Wetlands in general are areas where water covers the soil or saturates it long enough to influence plant growth, soil chemistry, and animal life. The presence of persistent water changes oxygen availability in the ground. Oxygen diffuses through water much more slowly than through air, so saturated soils quickly become low oxygen environments. Most typical land plants struggle in those conditions because their roots rely on oxygen for respiration. Swamp vegetation, by contrast, has developed adaptations that allow survival in these saturated conditions. Many swamp trees possess specialized root systems. Some grow shallow, spreading roots rather than deep taproots because deeper soil layers remain waterlogged. Others develop structures called pneumatophores, which are upward-growing roots that stick out above the water surface to access oxygen directly from the air. Bald cypress trees in North American swamps produce distinctive knees, woody protrusions rising from submerged roots. Mangrove trees in coastal tropical swamps form arching stilt roots that stabilize them in soft sediment while also allowing gas exchange. These structural adaptations are visible above water, but their functional importance lies mostly beneath the surface. Soil composition in swamps also differs from typical terrestrial soil. Continuous moisture slows decomposition because many decomposer organisms require oxygen. Instead of fully breaking down, plant material accumulates as partially decomposed organic matter. Over years or centuries, this can form thick peat layers. Peat stores carbon, influences water chemistry, and alters ground stability. When dry land plants grow, die, and decompose, carbon cycles back to the atmosphere relatively quickly. In swamps, that process slows dramatically. Carbon remains locked in soil for extended periods, making wetlands important carbon reservoirs. Hydrology plays another defining role. Some swamps are permanently flooded, meaning standing water remains year-round. Others flood seasonally, perhaps during rainy months or river overflow periods, then partially dry out. Flood patterns determine which plant and animal species can thrive. Fish adapted to low oxygen conditions may dominate in permanently flooded swamps. Amphibians often use seasonal swamps for breeding because temporary water reduces fish predators. Birds adjust nesting patterns based on water levels. Even insects synchronize life cycles with flood timing. Water sources vary widely. Riverine swamps receive overflow from rivers or streams. Lacustrine swamps connect to lakes. Palustrine swamps exist in isolated depressions fed by rainfall or groundwater. Coastal swamps, particularly mangrove systems, interact with tidal saltwater. Each water source brings different nutrient loads, salinity levels, and sediment types. That diversity explains why swamps in different regions can look dramatically different, while still fitting the same general definition. The difference between swamps and marshes is often misunderstood. Marshes are dominated by grasses, reeds, or sedges rather than trees. They tend to have more open water visibility and shallower vegetation height. Bogs, another wetland category, differ chemically. They often receive water mainly from precipitation rather than groundwater or rivers, leading to acidic conditions and specialised moss growth, especially sphagnum moss. Fens resemble bogs, but receive mineral-rich groundwater, making them less acidic. These distinctions matter for ecology, conservation, and land management. Climate strongly influences swamp characteristics. Tropical swamps often maintain high temperatures year-round, accelerating biological processes despite water saturation. Mangrove swamps along tropical coasts support complex marine and terrestrial interactions. Temperate swamps experience seasonal temperature swings. Deciduous swamp trees shed leaves annually, contributing to organic sediment layers. Cold climate swamps may freeze seasonally, altering oxygen exchange and microbial activity. Those cycles shape nutrient availability and species adaptation. Animal life in swamps reflects these conditions. Fish species often tolerate lower oxygen levels than their open water counterparts. Some possess specialized gill structures or behaviors like gulping air at the surface. Amphibians rely on shallow water for breeding but often require nearby dry ground for adult life stages. Reptiles, including alligators or crocodiles in certain regions, use swamps as hunting grounds because dense vegetation provides cover. Birds exploit abundant food sources, nesting in trees above water where predators have limited access. Invertebrates form a significant portion of swamp ecosystems. Aquatic insects, crustaceans, and mollusks process organic matter, serving as food for fish, birds, and amphibians. Mosquitoes receive disproportionate attention because of human discomfort, but they represent only a small fraction of insect diversity in wetlands. Many insects actually reduce mosquito populations by preying on larvae or competing for resources. Dragonflies, for example, spend early life stages underwater as active predators. Chemical processes beneath the water surface remain constant. Anaerobic decomposition produces gases such as methane and carbon dioxide. Methane formation occurs when microbes break down organic matter without oxygen. Those gases sometimes appear as bubbles rising through mud. While visible occasionally, most gas exchange happens gradually. This process contributes to global greenhouse gas dynamics. Wetlands both store carbon and release methane, making them complex components of climate systems. Water chemistry also shifts continuously. Nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus cycle through plant uptake, microbial transformation, and sediment deposition. Swamps often act as nutrient buffers. Excess nutrients entering from agricultural runoff or urban drainage may be partially absorbed before reaching rivers or coastal waters. That buffering effect reduces algal blooms downstream. Removing swamps can therefore have unintended consequences for water quality far beyond the wetland itself. Physical structure above water influences microclimates. Dense tree canopies reduce direct sunlight reaching water surfaces, lowering evaporation rates. Shade moderates temperature fluctuations. Humidity tends to remain high. These conditions affect decomposition speed, insect activity, and plant growth patterns. Even slight changes in canopy density can shift ecological balance. Human interaction with swamps has historically oscillated between avoidance and utilization. Some societies relied on wetlands for fishing, plant harvesting, and transportation via waterways. Others drained swamps for agriculture, urban development, or mosquito control campaigns. Modern environmental science recognizes both the benefits and vulnerabilities of wetlands. Conservation efforts often focus on balancing ecological protection with economic needs. Misconceptions persist partly because swamps can be visually inaccessible. Dense vegetation limits sightlines. Water clarity may be low. Movement is slower compared to dry land. Those factors create an impression of inactivity or monotony. Scientific observation reveals the opposite. Activity simply occurs in ways less immediately visible. Mapping swamps has become more accurate with satellite imagery. Remote sensing identifies moisture patterns, vegetation types, and seasonal flooding extents. These data help track wetland loss, restoration success, and climate impacts. Still, ground-level research remains essential for understanding biological interactions. Instruments placed in sediment measure gas flux. Water samples reveal microbial communities. Acoustic monitoring detects species presence even when visual confirmation is difficult. Swamps also influence surrounding ecosystems. Flood mitigation is a significant function. Wetlands absorb excess water during heavy rains, reducing downstream flooding risk. Vegetation slows water flow, allowing gradual release. This natural buffering can complement engineered flood control systems. Removing wetlands often increases flood vulnerability elsewhere. There is also a connection to fisheries. Many commercially important fish species spend early life stages in swamp-like estuarine environments. Mangrove swamps, for instance, serve as nurseries where juvenile fish find shelter from predators. Healthy wetlands therefore support broader marine food webs and human food supplies. Fire dynamics differ as well. Waterlogged conditions typically reduce fire risk, but prolonged drought can dry peat layers. When peat ignites, fires can burn underground for extended periods, releasing stored carbon. These events are difficult to extinguish because flames may not be visible above ground. Monitoring wetland moisture levels helps anticipate such risks. Cultural associations with swamps vary globally. Some traditions regard wetlands as sacred or symbolically significant. Others treat them as frontier spaces or sources of livelihood. Literature and film sometimes emphasize mystery or danger, shaping public perception more than scientific information does. Changing that perception requires accessible education without dismissing legitimate concerns like disease vectors or difficult terrain. Disease ecology is another practical aspect. Standing water can support mosquito species capable of transmitting illnesses. Effective management focuses on ecological balance rather than elimination. Healthy predator populations, water flow management, and habitat diversity often reduce disease risk more sustainably than broad chemical interventions. Restoration projects illustrate how complex swamp ecosystems are. Recreating hydrology, soil composition, and vegetation simultaneously proves challenging. Simply flooding an area does not automatically recreate a swamp. Soil microbes, seed banks, and long-term nutrient cycles all matter. Successful restoration typically involves gradual hydrological adjustment, planting native species, and monitoring over years rather than months. Climate change introduces additional variables. Sea level rise threatens coastal swamps, particularly mangrove systems. Altered rainfall patterns affect freshwater swamp flooding cycles. Temperature changes influence species distribution. Some wetlands may expand in certain regions while shrinking in others. Predicting those shifts requires continuous data collection. Technological advances continue improving understanding. Environmental DNA sampling detects species presence from water samples without direct capture. Autonomous underwater sensors record oxygen levels, temperature and chemical changes continuously. Drone imaging maps vegetation health. These tools reduce some logistical barriers that historically limited swamp research. Public access infrastructure sometimes includes boardwalks or observation towers designed to minimize ecological disturbance. Such structures allow educational engagement without damaging sensitive soil layers. Responsible tourism can increase appreciation while supporting conservation funding. Educational framing also matters. Presenting swamps only as problematic environments overlooks their ecological services. Presenting them only as pristine ignores management challenges. Balanced information helps communities make informed decisions about land use and conservation priorities. So, when defining what a swamp actually is, the simplest accurate description becomes this: a tree-dominated wetland shaped by persistent water saturation, specialized vegetation, distinctive soil chemistry, and continuous biological activity both visible and hidden. It is not merely mud and mosquitoes, it is a functioning ecological system interacting with climate, water cycles, and biodiversity on scales ranging from microscopic to regional. And once that basic definition settles into place, it becomes easier to look past surface impressions and start noticing how still water can conceal layered activity, how roots extend beneath what looks like open space, and how apparent quiet often reflects processes moving slowly rather than processes absent altogether, which naturally leads attention toward what that calm surface tends to hide when viewed a little more closely. At first glance, a swamp can appear unusually still. Water surfaces often reflect trees clearly enough to resemble mirrors. Ripples may be minimal, especially where wind is blocked by dense vegetation. Sound can feel muted compared to open lakes or rivers. Even movement seems slower there. Fish rarely break the surface dramatically. Birds often remain perched quietly, rather than constantly circling. That visual calm creates a strong impression that not much is happening, or that whatever activity exists must be minimal. In reality, still water rarely means inactive water, and in swamp environments, the opposite is usually true. Water in swamps does move, just not always in ways that are obvious. Flow may occur below the surface through channels formed by roots, sediment ridges, or slight elevation differences. Groundwater seepage can introduce slow currents invisible from above. Seasonal flooding introduces pulses of new water carrying nutrients, sediments, and microorganisms. Even slight temperature gradients can create convection currents. None of these movements produce the dramatic surface disturbances people associate with flowing rivers, but they continuously reshape the environment. Suspended particles contribute to the visual illusion. Swamp water often contains tannins released from decaying leaves, bark, and other plant material. These compounds tint the water brown or tea-coloured, reducing visibility below the surface. Clay particles and organic debris further limit light penetration. Because of this, observers cannot easily see fish, roots, or sediment layers beneath the water. Lack of visibility can easily be mistaken for lack of activity. Instead, it simply means the environment filters light differently. Roots play a major role beneath that calm surface. Tree roots extend outward and downward, forming dense networks that stabilize soil while absorbing nutrients. In flooded conditions, many species produce aerial roots or buttressed trunks that help with oxygen exchange. Beneath the waterline, those roots create complex physical structures. Fish use them as shelter. Amphibians lay eggs among them. Microorganisms colonize their surfaces. These root systems function somewhat like underwater forests, providing both habitat complexity and chemical exchange points. Microbial communities represent another hidden layer. Bacteria, archaea, and fungi break down organic material continuously. In oxygen-poor swamp sediments, anaerobic microbes dominate. Some specialize in methane production, others transform nitrogen compounds, affecting nutrient availability. These processes influence greenhouse gas emissions, plant growth, and water chemistry. Because microbes operate at microscopic scales, their activity remains invisible without specialized equipment, yet their cumulative impact shapes the entire ecosystem. Sediment layers accumulate gradually. Leaves, branches, pollen, and organic particles settle to the bottom. Over time, compression and partial decomposition form stratified layers. Scientists study these layers to reconstruct environmental history. Pollen trapped in sediment reveals past vegetation. Chemical signatures indicate historical climate conditions. Even traces of human activity can persist. A swamp bottom therefore functions partly as an environmental archive, storing information about decades or centuries of ecological change. Gas exchange provides another example of hidden dynamics. Methane, carbon dioxide, and other gases form during decomposition. Sometimes bubbles rise visibly, especially when sediments are disturbed. More often, gas diffusion occurs slowly through water or soil pores. These emissions contribute to atmospheric chemistry. Wetlands collectively play a significant role in global methane budgets. Yet an observer standing at the water's edge may notice nothing unusual beyond occasional faint odours. Temperature variation also influences subsurface activity. Surface water temperatures can fluctuate daily with sunlight exposure, while deeper sediments remain relatively stable. Organisms adapt to these gradients. Some fish stay near cooler sediment layers during hot periods. Microbial metabolic rates shift with temperature changes. Seasonal variations alter oxygen solubility, affecting which species dominate at different times of year. These changes unfold gradually, reinforcing the perception of stability even while biological turnover continues. Light limitation shapes behavior as well. Reduced visibility encourages ambush predation strategies. Reptiles such as alligators or crocodiles often remain motionless near the surface, blending with vegetation until prey approaches. Fish species rely more on vibration detection than sight. Amphibians use acoustic signals extensively. Birds hunting in swamps frequently depend on patience rather than pursuit. These behavioral adaptations align with environmental constraints, making activity less conspicuous to human observers. Sound transmission behaves differently over waterlogged terrain. Dense vegetation absorbs high-frequency noise. Humidity alters sound propagation. As a result, swamp environments sometimes feel quieter than they actually are. Insects may be active continuously, yet their collective sound blends into a consistent background hum. Frogs calling at night can create layered choruses that seem distant even when individuals are nearby. This acoustic masking contributes to the impression of stillness. Chemical gradients develop within the water column. Oxygen concentration typically decreases with depth in stagnant conditions. Nutrient concentrations vary depending on sediment composition and plant uptake. Some fish species tolerate low oxygen levels by surfacing periodically or possessing specialized hemoglobin structures. Plants adapt through erenchyma tissues that transport oxygen internally from leaves to roots. These physiological adjustments reflect ongoing chemical dynamics that remain hidden unless measured directly. Seasonal flooding introduces periodic transformation. Heavy rains or river overflow can raise water levels significantly. Areas previously dry become submerged. Aquatic species expand into new territory temporarily. When waters recede, stranded nutrients enrich soil, supporting plant growth. These cycles maintain productivity. From a casual perspective, the landscape might appear unchanged year to year, yet seasonal pulses drive ecological renewal. Decomposition rates in swamps differ from dry forests. Low oxygen slows breakdown, allowing organic matter accumulation. However, specialized microbes ensure decomposition never stops entirely. Balance between accumulation and decay determines peat formation rates. Disturbances such as drought or drainage can accelerate oxidation of stored organic matter, releasing carbon. Thus, stability of water levels influences global carbon cycling. Water chemistry also influences plant distribution. Slight variations in pH, salinity, or nutrient levels determine which species dominate. Coastal mangrove swamps, for example, tolerate saltwater intrusion. Freshwater swamps support different tree assemblages. Transitional zones may host mixed communities. These gradients develop subtly, not always visible above water, yet strongly affecting biodiversity. Human observation methods can inadvertently reinforce the illusion of inactivity. Brief visits during daylight hours may miss nocturnal animal behavior. Surface observations overlook sediment processes. Without instrumentation, gas flux or microbial activity remain undetected. Long-term monitoring consistently reveals higher activity levels than casual inspection suggests. Technological advances help correct those misconceptions. Underwater cameras, acoustic sensors, and chemical probes provide continuous data. Remote sensing satellites detect seasonal flooding patterns invisible from ground level. Environmental DNA analysis identifies species from trace genetic material in water samples. These tools confirm that swamp ecosystems operate continuously, despite apparent calm. Insects deserve specific mention because they illustrate both visibility and invisibility simultaneously. Adult mosquitoes are noticeable, yet larval stages develop underwater largely unseen. Dragonfly larvae hunt beneath the surface before emerging as flying adults. Beetles, midges, and other aquatic insects process organic debris. Their cumulative biomass supports fish and bird populations. Visible annoyance often distracts from ecological importance. Plant litterfall contributes to nutrient cycling. Leaves drop into water, gradually decomposing. Some nutrients dissolve quickly, others remain bound in sediment. Fungal colonization initiates breakdown. Detritivores consume partially decomposed material. This detrital food web sustains many swamp organisms. The process occurs quietly, without dramatic visual cues. Water clarity changes over time. After storms, sediment suspension increases turbidity. During dry periods, clearer water may briefly reveal submerged structures. These fluctuations influence predator-prey interactions. Fish may exploit murkiness for concealment. Visual predators adjust hunting strategies accordingly. Even air above swamps interacts with the ecosystem. Evaporation adds moisture to the atmosphere. Plant transpiration contributes additional water vapor. Local humidity often exceeds surrounding upland areas. This microclimate influences nearby vegetation patterns and weather conditions. Subtle atmospheric exchanges rarely draw attention, but remain constant. Historical records show how persistent these processes are. Sediment cores extracted from long-established swamps reveal ecological continuity spanning centuries. Changes occur gradually, unless disrupted by human intervention or major climate shifts. Stability does not imply stagnation. Rather, it reflects balanced ongoing processes. Public perception sometimes equates stillness with lack of vitality. Swamps challenge that assumption. Biological productivity can be high even where motion appears minimal. Quiet environments often host complex interactions operating below immediate sensory thresholds. Recognizing that helps shift interpretation from neglect to appreciation. Educational programs increasingly emphasize experiential learning. Guided wetland walks, canoe surveys, and citizen science monitoring introduce people to subtle cues indicating activity. Small ripples from fish, bubble trails from gas release, insect emergence patterns. These observations train attention beyond obvious movement. Conservation planning relies on understanding these hidden processes. Water management decisions, pollution control, and habitat restoration all depend on recognizing subsurface dynamics. Ignoring them risks unintended consequences, such as altered flooding regimes or biodiversity loss. So, the calm surface of a swamp functions less as an indicator of inactivity and more as a visual filter. Beneath it, roots grow, microbes transform nutrients, animals navigate complex habitats, gases exchange with the atmosphere, and sediments record environmental history. None of this demands dramatic motion to remain effective. Once that realization settles in, attention naturally shifts from surface appearance to structural complexity below it, where submerged root networks, soil composition, and plant adaptations form the physical framework supporting everything else, quietly shaping how life persists in saturated ground without drawing obvious attention above the waterline. When standing near a swamp, it can be easy to focus on what is immediately visible: trees rising from shallow water, reflections on the surface, insects moving through the air, maybe the occasional ripple hinting at something beneath. What tends to go unnoticed is the ground itself, not just the top layer but the accumulated material beneath it. Swamps often sit on thick layers of organic sediment that formed slowly over decades, centuries, sometimes even thousands of years. That material, commonly referred to as peat or organic mud depending on its composition and stage of decomposition, acts as a kind of long-term environmental memory. Peat begins with plant growth. Leaves, branches, bark, pollen, grasses and aquatic plants grow, die, and fall into waterlogged soil. In dry environments, those materials decompose quickly because oxygen is abundant and microbes break them down efficiently. In swamps, oxygen levels in the soil remain low because water fills the spaces between particles. Oxygen diffuses slowly through water, so decomposition slows. Material accumulates faster than it decays. Over time, layers build up, compressing under their own weight. This process is gradual. A few millimeters of peat might form each year under stable conditions. That means a meter-thick deposit can represent centuries of ecological history. Each layer contains traces of the plants that grew at the time, microscopic organisms, mineral particles from flooding events, and chemical signatures reflecting climate conditions. Scientists studying these layers can reconstruct environmental change with surprising precision. Peat is not uniform. Early stages consist of recognizable plant fragments, sometimes still identifiable as leaves or stems. As compression continues, those fragments break down further. Chemical changes occur. Water content shifts. The material becomes darker, denser, and more homogeneous. Eventually, under certain conditions, peat can transform into coal over geological timescales, though that requires pressure and time far beyond typical modern swamp environments. The term mud is often used casually, but swamp mud usually contains a significant proportion of organic matter rather than just mineral sediment. That distinction matters because organic, rich mud behaves differently physically and chemically. It retains water more effectively, it compresses easily, it stores nutrients differently. It also influences the types of organisms able to live there. From a chemical perspective, peat soils tend to be acidic because organic acids accumulate as plant material breaks down incompletely. This acidity affects plant selection. Certain species tolerate it well, while others cannot survive. That selective pressure shapes swamp vegetation over long periods. Acidity also influences microbial communities, determining which decomposition pathways dominate. Carbon storage in peatlands has global significance. Although wetlands cover a relatively small percentage of Earth's land surface, they store a disproportionately large share of soil carbon. When peat remains waterlogged, carbon stays trapped. When wetlands are drained, oxygen enters the soil, accelerating decomposition and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That connection links local land management decisions to broader climate processes. Peat layers also record disturbances. A major flood may deposit a thin mineral sediment layer within organic deposits. A drought period might allow temporary oxidation of upper peat layers, leaving distinct chemical signatures. Fire events, though less common in saturated environments, can leave charcoal traces. Even human activity such as agriculture or industrial pollution leaves identifiable markers. Pollen analysis is one of the most widely used methods for studying peat layers. Plants release pollen that settles into wetlands. Because pollen grains have durable outer walls, they preserve well. By identifying pollen types in successive layers, researchers reconstruct past vegetation patterns. Changes in pollen composition may indicate climate shifts, land use changes, or ecological succession. In addition to pollen, microfossils like diatoms, tiny algae with silica shells, provide information about past water conditions. Diatom species vary depending on salinity, nutrient levels, and pH. Their preserved remains help scientists infer historical hydrological conditions. This type of analysis contributes to long-term environmental monitoring. Physical stability of peat soils differs from mineral soils. Because peat contains high water content and loosely packed organic fibres, it compresses under pressure. Walking on thick peat can feel spongy. Heavy equipment may sink without proper support. That characteristic complicates construction and infrastructure development in wetland areas. Engineering solutions often require specialised foundations or avoidance altogether. Hydrology interacts closely with peat formation. Consistent water saturation maintains low oxygen conditions necessary for accumulation. If water levels fluctuate widely, decomposition may outpace accumulation. Stable hydrology therefore supports long-term peat development. Altering water flow, whether through drainage, damming, or climate-driven rainfall changes, can shift this balance. Temperature also plays a role. Colder climates generally slow microbial activity further, allowing peat to accumulate more rapidly relative to decomposition. Tropical swamps, despite high productivity, sometimes show faster decomposition rates due to warmth, though water saturation still moderates the process. Each climate zone produces characteristic peat properties. Biological communities adapt to peat substrates. Some plants develop shallow root systems suited to soft ground. Others form buttressed trunks for stability. Mosses often dominate in acidic peat bogs, while forested swamps support tree species adapted to waterlogged soil. Animal species adjust accordingly, selecting nesting or feeding sites compatible with ground stability. Methane production is another key aspect of peat environments. Anaerobic microbes called methanogens break down organic matter without oxygen, producing methane gas. This gas can accumulate in sediments and occasionally escape as bubbles. Methane emissions from wetlands contribute significantly to global greenhouse gas budgets, though they are part of natural cycles that have operated long before industrial times. Water chemistry above peat soils reflects underlying processes. Dissolved organic carbon leaches into water, giving it darker coloration. Nutrient availability may be lower than in mineral-rich soils. That influences plant productivity and species diversity. Some aquatic plants specialise in nutrient-poor conditions, while others rely on seasonal nutrient influx from flooding. Human use of peat historically included fuel harvesting. Dried peat burned slowly and was traditionally used for heating in certain regions. Peat extraction alters wetland hydrology and carbon storage capacity. Modern environmental awareness has reduced large-scale peat harvesting in many areas, though it continues in some places. Archaeological preservation in peatlands can be remarkable. Low oxygen conditions inhibit decomposition of organic materials. Wooden tools, textiles, even human remains have been found preserved for centuries in some peat bogs. These discoveries provide valuable historical insights while also illustrating the preservative properties of waterlogged organic soils. Scientific sampling of peat requires careful methods. Core extraction involves inserting cylindrical tools into the ground to retrieve vertical sediment columns. Maintaining layer integrity is essential for accurate analysis. Samples are often dated using radiocarbon techniques, allowing chronological reconstruction of environmental history. Peat accumulation also influences hydrological buffering. Thick organic layers absorb and release water slowly. During heavy rainfall, peatlands can reduce downstream flooding by storing excess water temporarily. During dry periods, stored moisture sustains plant communities. This sponge-like function supports regional water balance. Nutrient cycling within peat soils tends to be conservative. Slow decomposition limits nutrient release. Some plants adapt by forming symbiotic relationships with fungi that enhance nutrient uptake. Others capture nutrients from insects, as seen in carnivorous plants, inhabiting certain nutrient-poor wetlands. Disturbances can disrupt long-established peat systems. Drainage accelerates decomposition. Fire can consume surface layers. Pollution alters chemical balances. Recovery from such disturbances often requires long timescales because peat formation itself is slow. Restoration projects focus on re-establishing water saturation and native vegetation to restart accumulation processes. Climate feedback loops involve peatlands significantly. Warming temperatures may increase decomposition rates, releasing stored carbon. Conversely, expanding wetlands in certain regions could increase carbon sequestration. Predicting net effects remains an active research area involving climatology, ecology, and hydrology. Public awareness of peatlands remains limited compared to forests or oceans, yet their ecological importance is substantial. Education initiatives emphasize carbon storage, biodiversity, and water regulation functions. Increased recognition supports conservation policies aimed at protecting existing wetlands and restoring degraded ones. Field researchers working in peat-rich swamps often use boardwalks or floating platforms to minimize soil disturbance. Even light foot traffic can compress surface layers, altering hydrology and plant growth. Long-term monitoring sites require careful management to avoid influencing the systems being studied. Chemical analysis of peat reveals more than carbon content. Nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and trace metals accumulate differently depending on environmental conditions. Pollution events sometimes leave identifiable spikes in these elements, providing historical environmental records similar to tree rings. Peatlands also interact with surrounding ecosystems. Nutrient export to rivers influences downstream productivity. Migratory birds use wetlands as stopover habitats. Fish species may utilize floodplain swamps seasonally. These connections illustrate that peat-forming wetlands are not isolated, but integrated into broader ecological networks. So, when considering what lies beneath a swamp surface, peat and organic mud represent both physical foundation and historical record. They accumulate slowly, store carbon, preserve biological traces, influence hydrology, and shape the vegetation growing above them. What looks like simple mud from above often contains centuries of ecological information layered quietly below. And once attention shifts from the ground itself to the living structures growing through it, particularly the complex root systems that stabilize trees and support aquatic life, it becomes easier to see how those hidden foundations support entire communities without drawing obvious attention above the waterline. If you look across a swamp from a distance, trees appear to rise directly out of the water. Their trunks stand upright, sometimes reflected so clearly on the surface that it feels like two forests exist at once, one above and one mirrored below. What that view does not show very clearly is the structure actually holding those trees upright. Beneath the waterline, below the mud, and often extending outward farther than the visible canopy, there is an extensive network of roots performing constant work. These roots anchor trees in unstable soil, supply oxygen where little is available, transport nutrients through saturated ground, and quietly create habitat for countless organisms. Without them, swamp forests would not exist in anything like their current form. Roots in dry soil typically grow downward seeking water, while also spreading laterally for stability. Oxygen is readily available between soil particles, so respiration is rarely limited. Swamp soils reverse those priorities. Water saturation means moisture is abundant but oxygen is scarce. Roots must adapt not to find water, but to obtain air. That shift drives many of the unusual root structures associated with swamp trees. One common adaptation involves shallow root systems. Instead of deep tap roots, many swamp trees spread roots horizontally near the surface, where oxygen exchange is slightly easier. These roots interweave with those of neighbouring trees, creating a stabilising mesh. That network prevents individual trees from tipping in soft ground. It also slows water movement, trapping sediment and organic matter. Over time, this stabilisation gradually builds slightly raised hummocks where new seedlings can establish. Certain species go further by producing aerial roots. Bald cypress trees, often seen in North American swamps, develop woody projections known informally as knees. These structures rise above the water or mud surface from submerged roots. Their exact function has been studied extensively, and while stabilisation likely plays a role, gas exchange appears central. The protrusions allow oxygen diffusion into tissues that would otherwise remain submerged in low oxygen soil. Mangrove trees in coastal tropical swamps present another well-known example. Many species produce prop roots that arch outward from trunks into the water before entering the sediment. These roots form intricate lattice-like structures. Besides stabilising trees against tides and waves, they increase surface area for oxygen absorption. Some mangroves also develop pencil-like pneumatophores, vertical roots protruding above the mud specifically for gas exchange. These specialised forms illustrate how strongly waterlogged conditions shape plant morphology. Root tissues themselves adapt internally. Many swamp plants develop erenchyma, spongy tissue containing air spaces that transport oxygen from above water leaves down to submerged roots. This internal ventilation system allows respiration to continue despite surrounding anaerobic soil. Without it, root cells would suffocate. The efficiency of this system varies among species, influencing which trees dominate particular swamp types. Beyond supporting individual trees, root networks shape entire ecosystems. Dense roots reduce erosion by binding sediment. Floodwaters entering a swamp slow significantly when encountering root barriers. Sediment carried by water settles out rather than continuing downstream. This process contributes to natural water filtration and land formation. Over long periods, root-stabilized sediment can gradually expand swamp area. Roots also influence water chemistry. Through nutrient uptake, they remove nitrogen, phosphorus, and other dissolved compounds. Some nutrients become incorporated into plant tissues. Others cycle through leaf fall and decomposition. Root-associated microbes play key roles here. Symbiotic bacteria and fungi help transform nutrients into forms plants can use. This partnership maintains nutrient balance in environments where direct availability may fluctuate. Microbial life around roots, known collectively as the rhizosphere, becomes especially active in swamps. Oxygen transported through roots leaks slightly into surrounding sediment, creating localized microzones where aerobic microbes can function. Just millimeters away, anaerobic conditions dominate. This patchwork allows diverse microbial communities to coexist. Each group performs different chemical transformations affecting nutrient cycling and gas production. Aquatic animals depend heavily on submerged roots for shelter. Fish use them as hiding places from predators. Juvenile fish in particular benefit from the structural complexity. Amphibians deposit eggs among roots where water movement is reduced. Crustaceans, mollusks, and aquatic insects colonize root surfaces. Algae grow on submerged wood, providing food for herbivorous species. The root network effectively acts as underwater habitat infrastructure. Predators also exploit these structures. Ambush hunters position themselves among roots where visibility is limited. Reptiles, including certain snakes and crocodilians, remain motionless within root shadows. Birds hunting fish often perch on exposed roots or low branches using elevated vantage points. These interactions occur continuously yet may remain unnoticed unless one watches carefully for extended periods. Root decay contributes further complexity. Not all roots remain alive simultaneously. As older roots die, they decompose slowly in low oxygen conditions. Hollow channels may form. Sediment fills some spaces while others remain open temporarily. These microhabitats support additional organisms, including burrowing invertebrates and microorganisms involved in decomposition. Mechanical stability in saturated soil remains a constant challenge. Windstorms or flooding can exert significant force on trees. Interconnected root systems distribute that force across multiple individuals. This communal stabilization explains why swamp forests sometimes withstand storms better than isolated upland trees. Damage still occurs, but networked support increases resilience. Salinity gradients affect coastal swamp root adaptations. Mangrove species cope with saltwater intrusion through filtration mechanisms at root surfaces. Some exclude salt at entry points. Others tolerate internal salt concentrations and excrete excess through specialized leaf glands. Root structure supports these physiological processes by controlling water uptake carefully. Oxygen availability fluctuates seasonally. Flooding intensity, temperature, and microbial activity all influence oxygen levels in sediment. Roots adjust growth patterns accordingly. New aerial roots may form during prolonged flooding. Older roots may die back when oxygen becomes too limited. These adjustments happen gradually, aligning plant growth with environmental conditions. Root exudates, chemicals released by roots into surrounding soil, influence microbial communities and nutrient availability. Sugars, organic acids, and other compounds serve as microbial food sources. Some exudates inhibit competing plant species or pathogenic microbes. These chemical interactions shape plant distribution patterns subtly but consistently. Ground stability from roots affects human infrastructure decisions in wetland regions. Construction projects must consider root integrity to avoid destabilizing soil. Removing swamp vegetation often leads to erosion or subsidence. Restoration efforts frequently begin with re-establishing native plant species precisely because root systems rebuild structural stability. Carbon cycling again connects to root activity. Roots contribute organic material both while alive through exudates and after death through decomposition. Root-derived carbon often persists longer in soil than leaf-derived carbon because it integrates directly into sediment structure. This process reinforces wetlands' role as carbon sinks. Scientific study of submerged roots presents logistical challenges. Visibility underwater is limited. Excavation risks damaging delicate structures. Researchers use sonar imaging, sediment cores, and occasionally transparent observation chambers to study root growth patterns without excessive disturbance. Advances in imaging technology continue improving understanding of below-surface plant architecture. Root competition occurs even in saturated soils. Trees vie for limited oxygen, nutrients, and space. Some species grow faster or develop more efficient gas exchange structures. Over time, competitive balance determines forest composition. These dynamics unfold slowly, often over decades, making them less obvious than rapid ecological changes. Root systems also interact with fungi through mycorrhizal associations. Fungal networks extend beyond roots, increasing nutrient absorption capacity. In waterlogged soils, these associations adapt to low oxygen conditions differently than in upland forests. Research into swamp mycorrhizae remains ongoing, but evidence suggests they play important roles in nutrient cycling and plant health. Animal movement patterns often follow root corridors. Fish navigate through submerged root channels. Small mammals use elevated root mounds for drier footing. Reptiles bask on exposed roots. These behavioral adaptations demonstrate how physical plant structures shape animal ecology directly. Leaf litter trapped among roots decomposes gradually. contributing to sediment accumulation. Roots act as natural sieves capturing floating debris. This process enhances nutrient retention within the swamp rather than allowing organic matter to wash away. Over long timescales, it supports peat formation discussed earlier. Storm events highlight root importance dramatically. High winds and flood surges test anchoring strength. Trees with well-developed lateral roots and interconnected systems resist uprooting more effectively. Observations after hurricanes or cyclones often show intact mangrove belts, protecting inland areas from erosion and storm surge impact. So when considering what lies beneath swamp water, the hidden architecture of roots forms a central element. These structures anchor trees in unstable ground, facilitate oxygen exchange, support microbial communities, stabilize sediment, influence water chemistry, and create habitat for diverse organisms. Their presence explains how forested wetlands maintain structure despite conditions that would challenge most terrestrial vegetation. And once that structural foundation becomes clearer, attention naturally shifts toward the animals moving quietly among those roots. The fish, reptiles, amphibians, and other submerged inhabitants that rely on this hidden framework while remaining largely out of sight from above the water surface. If you spend time near a swamp, especially during quiet hours when wind is minimal and surface reflections remain undisturbed, you might notice something curious. There are signs of life everywhere, occasional ripples, faint splashes, subtle movement in shadows, yet actual animals are often difficult to see clearly. This is not because swamps lack wildlife. Quite the opposite. Many species living there evolved specifically to remain inconspicuous. Water coloration, submerged roots, floating vegetation, and low light conditions create an environment where visibility is limited, so survival often depends on blending in rather than standing out. Fish are among the most numerous yet least visible inhabitants. Swamp waters frequently contain suspended organic material that reduces clarity. Tannins from decomposing leaves stain water brown, sometimes almost opaque. Fish adapted to these conditions often rely less on vision and more on vibration detection. Many possess highly developed lateral line systems that sense movement in surrounding water. This allows them to detect predators, prey, and obstacles even when visibility is poor. Low oxygen levels present another challenge. Because swamp water tends to be stagnant, oxygen replenishment occurs slowly. Some fish species have evolved remarkable adaptations to cope. Certain species gulp air directly at the surface, absorbing oxygen through specialized tissues in their mouths or digestive tracts. Others possess hemoglobin variants that bind oxygen more efficiently. These physiological adjustments allow fish to thrive where many typical freshwater species could not survive. Behaviorally, swamp fish often minimize unnecessary movement. Constant swimming would consume oxygen quickly. Remaining still conserves energy and reduces detection risk. Ambush feeding becomes common. Predatory fish wait among roots or vegetation until prey approaches. Prey species likewise stay close to shelter, darting quickly when necessary rather than cruising openly. Seasonal flooding expands available habitat. During high water periods, fish disperse into newly flooded forest areas. This expansion provides access to fresh food sources including insects, fallen fruit, and organic debris. When waters recede, fish retreat to deeper channels or permanent pools. These cycles shape breeding strategies, migration timing, and population dynamics. Reptiles represent another group frequently present yet seldom observed directly. Many species depend on still water for hunting. Crocodilians, such as alligators or crocodiles depending on region, illustrate classic ambush predation. Their eyes and nostrils sit atop the head, allowing most of the body to remain submerged. From a distance, only small protrusions break the surface, easily mistaken for floating debris. Snakes adapted to wetland environments often show similar concealment strategies. Some species swim efficiently with minimal surface disturbance. Others remain coiled among submerged branches, camouflage patterns blend with water reflections, leaf litter, or mud coloration. Observers may pass nearby without noticing them at all. Turtles are widespread in many swamp systems. Aquatic turtles spend significant time underwater, surfacing briefly for air before submerging again. Their shells frequently accumulate algae, further enhancing camouflage. Some species bury themselves partially in sediment during cooler periods or drought conditions. These behaviours reduce visibility while also conserving energy. Amphibians bridge aquatic and terrestrial environments. Frogs, salamanders, and related species often begin life in water before transitioning partially to land. Swamps provide breeding grounds with relatively stable water levels and abundant shelter. Eggs attach to submerged vegetation or float in gelatinous clusters. Larvae develop underwater, feeding on algae or small invertebrates. Adult amphibians frequently remain near water edges. Their skin permeability requires moist environments. Camouflage coloration, combined with stillness, makes them difficult to spot. Vocalizations, especially at night, often provide the clearest evidence of their presence. Chorus intensity can suggest large populations even when individuals remain unseen. Silent swimmers extend beyond vertebrates. Crustaceans, aquatic insects and mollusks move through submerged habitats constantly. Crayfish dig burrows in soft sediment. Water beetles hunt smaller invertebrates. Snails graze on algae coating submerged surfaces. Though small individually, the combined biomass supports higher trophic levels. Predator-prey interactions in swamps tend toward patience rather than speed. Reduced visibility favours ambush tactics. Quick bursts of motion replace sustained chases. Energy conservation becomes critical where oxygen availability fluctuates. These ecological pressures shape anatomy, coloration and behaviour across species. Coloration itself often reflects swamp conditions. Darker tones dominate, matching watercolour and sediment. Reflective scales or glossy skin can mimic light patterns on water surfaces. Pattern disruption, spots, stripes, irregular shading, helps animals blend with complex backgrounds of roots and floating vegetation. Sound cues substitute for visual ones frequently. Fish produce low-frequency vibrations. Amphibians use calls for mating and territorial communication. Reptiles may rely on substrate vibrations to detect movement. These sensory adaptations align with environmental constraints where sight alone proves unreliable. Temperature gradients influence animal distribution. Shallow water warms faster than deeper channels. Some species shift position daily to regulate body temperature. Reptiles bask briefly on exposed logs before returning to water. Fish move vertically within the water column seeking optimal conditions. Feeding strategies vary widely. Herbivorous fish consume aquatic plants or algae. Carnivorous species target insects, smaller fish, or amphibians. Omnivores exploit whatever resources become available seasonally. Flood events introduce terrestrial insects and plant matter, temporarily altering diet composition. Human observation bias often underestimates swamp biodiversity. Short visits during daylight miss nocturnal species. Surface-focused observation overlooks submerged activity. Researchers using underwater cameras or acoustic monitoring consistently record higher species diversity than casual observation suggests. Some swamp fish exhibit parental care behaviours. Nest building among roots or vegetation protects eggs from currents and predators. Mouth-brooding species carry eggs until hatching. These strategies improve survival rates in environments where external conditions fluctuate. Reproductive timing often aligns with hydrological cycles. Many species spawn during rising water levels when habitat expands and food availability increases. Juvenile survival improves when flooded vegetation provides shelter. As water recedes, young animals concentrate in remaining pools, where growth continues until the next flood cycle. Salinity gradients in coastal swamps introduce additional complexity. Some fish species tolerate both fresh and salt water, moving between environments seasonally. Reptiles may adjust habitat preference based on salinity changes. These transitions influence community composition over time. Disease ecology operates quietly in these environments. Parasites circulate among aquatic hosts. Healthy ecosystems maintain balance through predator-prey interactions and biodiversity. Disturbances sometimes shift that balance, emphasizing the importance of intact habitats. Scientific research methods continue evolving. Environmental DNA sampling allows detection of species presence from water samples without direct capture. Acoustic telemetry tracks fish movement using tagged individuals. Thermal imaging identifies reptile basking sites even when camouflage is effective. Conservation considerations often focus on habitat connectivity. Fragmented wetlands restrict migration routes. Maintaining water flow corridors supports population resilience. This applies particularly to fish species requiring seasonal movement between floodplains and permanent water bodies. Public education helps adjust perception. Swamps once considered unproductive are increasingly recognized as biodiversity hotspots. Documentaries, guided tours, and citizen science projects highlight hidden wildlife, fostering appreciation rather than avoidance. Cultural narratives sometimes exaggerate danger associated with swamp animals. While certain species require respectful distance, most avoid human contact. Understanding behavior reduces unnecessary fear and encourages responsible coexistence. Climate variability influences animal communities. Altered rainfall patterns affect flood timing. Temperature changes shift species ranges. Monitoring programs track these trends to anticipate conservation needs. So, beneath calm swamp surfaces, fish navigate dim water using vibration sensing, reptiles patrol silently with minimal disturbance, amphibians breed among submerged vegetation, and countless smaller organisms sustain food webs largely out of sight. Visibility limitations shape behavior, creating ecosystems where stillness often indicates adaptation rather than inactivity. And once attention settles on these submerged animals moving quietly through root networks and dark water, it becomes easier to notice the smaller inhabitants surrounding them, particularly insects, amphibians, and nocturnal species whose presence often reveals itself more through sound than sight, as evening conditions settle across wetland environments. As daylight fades over a swamp, something subtle begins to change. Visual activity does not necessarily increase dramatically, but sound often does. What may have seemed quiet during the day gradually fills with layered noise, steady insect buzzing, intermittent frog calls, occasional splashes, and background rustling that is difficult to pinpoint. This acoustic shift is not random. Many swamp species are more active during cooler evening hours, when humidity remains high and temperatures become less stressful. Darkness also reduces visibility for predators, allowing smaller animals to move more freely. Insects dominate this nighttime activity. Wetlands provide ideal breeding grounds for numerous insect species because standing water supports larval development. Mosquitoes are the most widely recognized example, largely because of their interaction with humans, but they represent only a fraction of swamp insect diversity. Midges, water beetles, dragonflies, damselflies, caddisflies, and various aquatic larvae all depend on wetland habitats. Their life cycles often include both aquatic and airborne stages, linking water and air ecosystems continuously. Mosquito larvae develop in shallow water where organic matter provides food. They breathe through specialized siphons reaching the surface. Still water conditions, reduce wave action, and abundant nutrients make swamps particularly suitable. However, mosquito populations do not exist unchecked. Numerous predators feed on larvae, including fish, amphibians, aquatic insects, and birds. Dragonfly larvae, for instance, are effective predators that help regulate mosquito numbers naturally. Adult insects serve multiple ecological roles. Some pollinate swamp plants, Others decompose organic material. Many form a crucial food base for amphibians, fish, birds, and small mammals. This trophic linkage illustrates how insect abundance supports higher biodiversity. Removing insect populations, whether through pollution or habitat loss, can cascade through the ecosystem. Dragonflies and damselflies illustrate complex wetland adaptation. Their larvae live underwater for extended periods, sometimes years, before emerging as winged adults. During larval stages, they are active predators, feeding on smaller aquatic organisms. After metamorphosis, adults continue hunting insects in flight. Their presence indicates relatively healthy aquatic conditions because larvae require stable water quality. Beetles form another significant aquatic insect group. Some species remain submerged throughout life, while others transition between aquatic and terrestrial phases. Water scavenger beetles feed on decaying organic matter. Predatory diving beetles hunt smaller insects and larvae. Their diversity contributes to nutrient cycling and population control within the wetland. Midges often go unnoticed individually but appear in large swarms. Their larvae inhabit sediment, feeding on organic particles. Adults provide food for fish and birds. While sometimes perceived as nuisances, they play important ecological roles, especially in nutrient recycling. Amphibians occupy an intermediate position between aquatic and terrestrial life. Frogs, toads, salamanders and newts rely heavily on wetlands for reproduction. Eggs typically develop in water where moisture prevents desiccation. Larval stages, such as tadpoles, feed on algae, detritus, or small organisms. As they mature, many species transition to partially terrestrial lifestyles while remaining tied to moist environments. Frog vocalizations dominate swamp night soundscapes in many regions. Calls serve multiple purposes, attracting mates, establishing territory, and signaling species identity. Each species produces distinct acoustic patterns. Some calls are rhythmic pulses, others consist of long trills or short chirps. Environmental acoustics influence call propagation. Water surfaces reflect sound, while vegetation absorbs higher frequencies, creating complex echo patterns. Salamanders often remain less audible than frogs, but are equally significant. Many species are nocturnal, emerging after dark to forage along damp surfaces. Some retain aquatic lifestyles entirely, breathing through gills or skin. Others transition to lung breathing while still requiring high humidity. Their sensitivity to environmental conditions makes them useful indicators of ecosystem health. Skin permeability in amphibians allows gas exchange but also increases vulnerability to pollutants. Chemicals entering water can affect development, reproduction, or survival. Because amphibians occupy both aquatic and terrestrial phases, they reflect environmental conditions across ecosystem boundaries. Declines in amphibian populations frequently signal broader ecological stress. Temperature and humidity strongly influence nocturnal activity. Insects and amphibians often avoid daytime heat, especially in tropical or subtropical swamps. Cooler nighttime conditions reduce water loss and metabolic stress. Increased humidity supports skin respiration in amphibians and flight efficiency in insects. Predators adapt to this nocturnal abundance. Bats forage over swamp water, capturing flying insects using echolocation. Owls hunt amphibians or small mammals drawn to wetland edges. Fish feed actively on insect larvae rising toward the surface. Reptiles may increase hunting activity after sunset when prey movement becomes more frequent. Light pollution increasingly affects swamp ecosystems near urban areas. Artificial lighting disrupts insect navigation, alters amphibian calling patterns, and changes predator-prey dynamics. Some insects are drawn toward lights, reducing breeding success in natural habitats. Amphibians may call less frequently under constant illumination, affecting reproduction. Seasonal variation shapes nocturnal sound intensity. Spring breeding seasons often produce the loudest amphibian choruses. Summer warmth increases insect activity. Cooler months reduce overall noise levels. Flooding events temporarily alter species composition, influencing acoustic patterns. Acoustic monitoring has become an important research tool. Automated recording devices capture nighttime soundscapes over extended periods. Scientists analyze frequency patterns to identify species presence and population trends. This method allows non-invasive monitoring, particularly useful in sensitive wetland habitats. The term night chorus describes collective amphibian calling, but it also encompasses insect sounds and occasional bird calls. The combined effect creates a consistent acoustic background that experienced listeners can interpret. Changes in intensity, pitch distribution, or timing may indicate environmental shifts. Human perception of swamp sounds varies culturally. Some people find the chorus soothing, others perceive it as chaotic or unsettling. Familiarity often influences interpretation. Education programs sometimes include guided nighttime wetland visits to help people understand ecological meaning behind the sounds. Moisture levels influence sound propagation. Humid air transmits sound differently than dry air. Water surfaces reflect low-frequency calls effectively. Dense vegetation dampens higher frequencies. These physical properties shape how swamp soundscapes are experienced. Certain amphibians time calls to avoid acoustic overlap with other species. Temporal partitioning reduces interference, improving communication efficiency. This behavior illustrates complex evolutionary adaptation to shared habitats. Egg-laying strategies vary widely among amphibians. Some deposit eggs directly in water, others attach them to submerged vegetation. Foam nests, gelatinous masses, or individually placed eggs reflect species-specific reproductive strategies adapted to wetland conditions. Insect emergence events can be dramatic, though brief. Large numbers of aquatic insects transition to adult form simultaneously. These pulses provide abundant food for fish, birds, and amphibians. Such events may pass quickly, leaving little visible trace afterward. Nutrient cycling connects insects and amphibians closely. Larval insects process organic matter in water. Adult insects transfer aquatic nutrients to terrestrial predators. Amphibians consume both aquatic and terrestrial prey, linking energy flows across ecosystem boundaries. Wetland management practices increasingly consider acoustic ecology. Maintaining natural hydrology, reducing pollution, and limiting light intrusion help preserve natural nocturnal activity patterns. Conservation success often correlates with stable amphibian populations and diverse insect communities. Climate variability introduces additional pressures. Altered rainfall patterns affect breeding water availability. Temperature changes influence insect life cycles. Monitoring long-term trends helps anticipate ecological responses to climate shifts. Public awareness campaigns sometimes highlight the ecological importance of insects and amphibians. Countering negative perceptions focus solely on nuisance aspects. Balanced understanding supports conservation initiatives while acknowledging practical concerns. So, when darkness settles over a swamp, what seems at first like simple background noise represents a complex network of biological activity. Insects breed, feed, and transfer nutrients. Amphibians communicate, reproduce, and regulate insect populations. Predators adapt to this increased nocturnal movement. The soundscape becomes an audible indicator of ecosystem health, even when individual animals remain hidden from sight. And once attention begins to recognize those smaller, often overlooked contributors to swamp life, it becomes easier to consider organisms even less visible, particularly the microscopic communities quietly driving decomposition, nutrient cycling, and chemical transformation beneath both water and sediment. When people imagine life in a swamp, they usually picture the visible residents first. Fish moving through dark water, insects hovering above it, frogs calling from hidden positions, maybe reptiles resting along muddy edges. Yet most biological activity there does not come from animals you can see at all. It comes from microorganisms working constantly beneath the water surface and inside saturated soil. These bacteria, archaea, microscopic fungi, and other tiny life forms drive the processes that keep wetlands functioning. Without them, plant material would accumulate without recycling, nutrients would remain locked away, and many larger organisms would lose the foundation that supports their survival. Decomposition is the most obvious role microbes play. Leaves, branches, dead insects, animal remains, pollen, algae, and other organic material continuously fall into swamp water. In dry environments, decomposition happens relatively quickly because oxygen is abundant. Microbes use oxygen to break down organic matter efficiently. In swamps, however, oxygen availability drops sharply once soil becomes saturated. Water blocks air spaces in sediment, creating conditions where aerobic decomposition slows. Microbes adapted to low oxygen or oxygen-free environments take over instead. These anaerobic microbes use alternative chemical pathways. Some break down organic material by reducing nitrate or sulfate compounds. Others produce methane through a process called methanogenesis. Methane-producing microbes, known as methanogens, are particularly common in swamp sediments. Their activity contributes to the gas bubbles occasionally seen rising from muddy bottoms. Those bubbles are not random. They reflect microbial metabolism operating out of sight. Fungi also contribute significantly to decomposition. Certain fungal species tolerate saturated conditions well. They colonize submerged wood, leaves, and plant roots. By secreting enzymes, they break down complex organic molecules such as cellulose and lignin. This process releases simpler compounds that bacteria can then metabolize further. The interaction between fungal and bacterial communities forms a coordinated system that recycles nutrients gradually. Nutrient cycling remains one of the most important microbial functions in wetlands. Nitrogen provides a clear example. Organic nitrogen locked in plant material becomes available again only after microbial breakdown. Certain bacteria convert ammonia to nitrate through nitrification, while others perform denitrification, returning nitrogen to the atmosphere as nitrogen gas. These transformations regulate nutrient availability for plants and algae. Without microbial mediation, nutrient imbalances would quickly develop. Phosphorus cycling follows similar patterns. Microbial activity releases phosphorus from organic compounds into forms plants can absorb. Sediment chemistry influences how long phosphorus remains available. Under low oxygen conditions typical of swamps, phosphorus often binds less tightly to sediments, affecting water chemistry. These shifts can influence plant productivity and algal growth patterns. Microbes also influence water clarity and colour. As they break down organic material, dissolved organic carbon enters the water column. Tannins and humic substances give swamp water its characteristic brown coloration. These compounds affect light penetration, which in turn influences photosynthesis by aquatic plants and algae. The result is a feedback loop where microbial activity shapes physical water properties that then influence broader ecosystem dynamics. Biofilms form on nearly every submerged surface. These thin microbial layers consist of bacteria, algae, fungi, and extracellular polymers binding them together. Biofilms coat roots, fallen branches, rocks, and sediment particles. They provide food for small invertebrates and contribute to nutrient cycling. Although individually microscopic, collectively they represent significant biomass within wetlands. Root-associated microbial communities deserve particular attention. Plant roots leak small amounts of oxygen and organic compounds into surrounding soil. These exudates create microhabitats where aerobic microbes can survive briefly in otherwise anaerobic sediment. Such microzones support diverse microbial populations performing specialized chemical transformations. The rhizosphere, the soil region influenced by roots, becomes a hotspot of microbial activity. Some microbes form mutualistic relationships with plants. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria, for example, convert atmospheric nitrogen into biologically usable forms. Certain swamp plants host these bacteria either in root nodules or surrounding soil. This partnership improves plant nutrition in nutrient-poor conditions. Fungal mycorrhizal associations extend root absorption capacity, improving nutrient uptake and water balance. Disease ecology also intersects with microbial communities. Pathogens affecting amphibians, fish, or plants often originate in waterborne microbial populations. Balanced ecosystems typically regulate pathogens spread through competition and predation among microbes. Environmental stress, pollution, or habitat disruption can upset that balance, increasing disease risk. Temperature strongly influences microbial metabolic rates. Warmer conditions accelerate decomposition and gas production. Cooler temperatures slow these processes. Seasonal temperature variation therefore alters nutrient cycling speed. Long-term climate trends may shift microbial community composition, affecting wetland carbon storage and greenhouse gas emissions. Oxygen gradients in swamp water are rarely uniform. Surface layers may contain some dissolved oxygen due to atmospheric contact and photosynthesis. Deeper water and sediments often remain oxygen poor. Microbial communities stratify accordingly. Aerobic bacteria dominate near the surface, while anaerobic groups prevail below. This vertical layering contributes to complex chemical dynamics. Iron and sulfur cycles operate prominently in wetlands. Certain bacteria reduce iron compounds, changing sediment color and chemistry. Sulfate-reducing bacteria produce hydrogen sulfide gas, responsible for the characteristic rotten egg smell sometimes noticed in marshy areas. These chemical transformations influence nutrient availability, plant growth, and water chemistry. Microbial mats occasionally form in shallow swamp areas. These layered communities of bacteria and algae create visible films on sediment surfaces. They participate actively in nutrient cycling and sometimes stabilize sediments against erosion. Though less common than in some marine environments, they illustrate microbial capacity to shape physical habitat structure. Scientific study of wetland microbes has expanded with advances in molecular biology. DNA sequencing allows identification of microbial species without culturing them in laboratories. Environmental DNA sampling reveals community composition directly from water or sediment samples. These techniques show far greater diversity than previously recognized. Metagenomics, the analysis of collective genetic material from environmental samples, provides insight into microbial metabolic capabilities. Researchers can identify genes responsible for methane production, nitrogen cycling, or pollutant degradation. This information improves understanding of ecosystem function and informs conservation strategies. Pollution impacts microbial communities significantly. Agricultural runoff introduces excess nutrients. Industrial contaminants alter chemical balances. Some microbes degrade pollutants, providing natural remediation. Others suffer population declines, reducing ecosystem resilience. Monitoring microbial responses helps assess wetland health. Bioremediation projects sometimes rely deliberately on wetland microbes. Constructed wetlands designed for wastewater treatment harness microbial processes to remove nutrients, heavy metals, and organic pollutants. These systems mimic natural swamps, demonstrating practical applications of microbial ecology. Carbon sequestration in wetlands depends heavily on microbial activity. Slow decomposition allows organic matter accumulation. However, microbial methane production offsets some carbon storage benefits. Understanding this balance remains a major research focus in climate science. Light availability affects microbial photosynthetic communities. Cyanobacteria and microalgae contribute primary production in shallow water. Their activity introduces oxygen locally and supports higher trophic levels. Reduced light penetration due to tannins limits their distribution, reinforcing reliance on heterotrophic microbes for energy flow. Hydrological stability influences microbial diversity. Frequent flooding introduces new microbes from upstream environments. Drought periods expose sediments to oxygen, altering community composition. Stable water levels support consistent microbial populations, while fluctuating conditions promote diversity but may reduce long-term carbon storage. Sediment disturbance, whether from animal movement, storms, or human activity, redistributes microbes and nutrients. Such disturbances can temporarily increase decomposition rates by introducing oxygen into previously anaerobic layers. Over time, conditions usually revert to baseline unless disturbance becomes chronic. Educational outreach increasingly emphasizes microbial roles because they remain largely invisible yet essential. Public understanding of wetlands often focuses on charismatic wildlife. Highlighting microbial contributions helps broaden appreciation of ecosystem complexity. So, beneath swamp water and within saturated soil, microbial communities operate continuously. They decompose organic matter, cycle nutrients, influence water chemistry, produce greenhouse gases, support plant growth, and contribute to pollutant breakdown. Their work rarely attracts attention because it happens at microscopic scales, but without it, visible swamp ecosystems would not function as they do. And once those unseen microbial processes become part of the picture, it becomes easier to notice another subtle phenomenon they produce: the gases forming in sediment and occasionally rising toward the surface, quietly indicating ongoing chemical transformation beneath what still appears from above to be calm water. If you stand quietly beside a swamp long enough, you might eventually notice small disturbances on the water surface that do not come from fish, wind, or falling debris. Tiny bubbles sometimes rise slowly, break the surface, and disappear without much sound. Occasionally there is a faint, earthy odour. These small details may seem insignificant, yet they point to an important process taking place beneath the water and within the sediment. Wetlands, including swamps, constantly exchange gases with the atmosphere. That exchange forms part of what scientists sometimes call the breath of these ecosystems, not in a literal respiratory sense, but as a steady movement of gases in and out driven by biological and chemical activity. Methane is one of the most discussed gases produced in swamps. It forms primarily through anaerobic decomposition, a process carried out by specialized microorganisms known as methanogens. These microbes thrive where oxygen is scarce, exactly the condition found in waterlogged soil. As plant material breaks down incompletely, methanogens convert organic compounds into methane gas. Because methane is less soluble in water than many other gases, it gradually accumulates in sediment until it escapes as bubbles. Those bubbles do not always travel directly upward. Root systems, sediment density, and water currents influence their path. Sometimes methane dissolves partially before reaching the surface. Other times it escapes rapidly when sediment is disturbed by animal movement or falling debris. Seasonal temperature changes affect this process too. Warmer temperatures accelerate microbial metabolism, increasing methane production. Cooler conditions slow it. Carbon dioxide also forms during decomposition. Even though wetlands store large amounts of carbon in peat and organic mud, some carbon returns to the atmosphere through microbial respiration. The balance between carbon storage and carbon release varies by wetland type, climate, and hydrological stability. Long-term water saturation generally favours storage, while drainage or prolonged drought accelerates carbon release. Nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas, can emerge from nitrogen cycling processes. Certain bacteria convert nitrate into nitrogen gas under low oxygen conditions. During intermediate steps, nitrous oxide may form. Although produced in smaller quantities than methane or carbon dioxide, it has strong greenhouse warming potential, making its study important for climate research. Hydrogen sulfide occasionally contributes to wetland gas emissions. Produced by sulfate-reducing bacteria, it carries a distinctive smell often described as similar to rotten eggs. Its presence indicates active sulfur cycling in anaerobic sediments. Concentrations in natural wetlands usually remain low enough not to pose health risks, though localized pockets can produce noticeable odor. Gas movement within wetlands does not occur only through bubbling. Diffusion plays a major role. Dissolved gases gradually move from areas of higher concentration to lower concentration. Plant-mediated transport represents another pathway. Some wetland plants, particularly those with erenchyma tissue, channel gases between roots and the atmosphere. Oxygen moves downward to roots, while methane or carbon dioxide can move upward through plant stems. This mechanism reduces bubbling but still contributes to atmospheric exchange. Plant species differ in their efficiency at gas transport. Tall emergent plants with extensive internal air channels often facilitate significant gas movement. Trees in forested swamps contribute as well, though their woody tissues differ structurally from grasses or reeds. These variations influence overall wetland greenhouse gas flux. Water level stability strongly affects gas exchange. Permanently flooded swamps maintain consistently low oxygen conditions in sediment, favouring methane production, but also preserving stored carbon. Seasonally flooded swamps may alternate between anaerobic and aerobic conditions. When sediments dry temporarily, oxygen penetrates deeper, accelerating decomposition and carbon dioxide release. Subsequent reflooding restarts methane production. Temperature gradients also shape gas dynamics. Surface water warms more quickly than deeper layers. Warm conditions increase microbial metabolic rates, raising gas production. Winter cooling reduces activity, though decomposition rarely stops completely unless freezing occurs. Tropical swamps with consistently warm temperatures often exhibit steady year-round gas emissions. Disturbances influence gas release patterns. Animal burrowing, fish movement, or falling branches can disrupt sediment layers, releasing trapped gases suddenly. Storm events stir water columns, mixing dissolved gases upward. Human activities such as dredging, drainage, or construction can dramatically alter gas flux by changing hydrology and sediment exposure. Wetlands play a complex role in global climate systems because they both store carbon and emit methane. Methane has stronger short-term warming effects than carbon dioxide but remains in the atmosphere for a shorter duration. Understanding this balance requires careful measurement of both storage and emissions. Scientists use chamber measurements, eddy covariance towers, and satellite observations to estimate wetland gas exchange. Eddy covariance towers measure gas concentrations above wetlands continuously. Sensors detect fluctuations in methane, carbon dioxide, and water vapour. Combined with wind data, these measurements estimate net gas flux over large areas. Such long-term data sets improve climate modelling accuracy. Remote sensing technologies complement ground measurements. Satellites detect vegetation health, water extent, and sometimes atmospheric methane concentrations. Integrating these data with field measurements helps track regional wetland contributions to greenhouse gas budgets. Natural variability complicates interpretation. Flood cycles, temperature changes, vegetation shifts, and microbial community dynamics all influence emissions. Long-term monitoring is essential to distinguish natural fluctuations from human-driven changes. Pollution can alter gas production. Nutrient runoff increases organic matter availability, potentially boosting microbial decomposition rates. Industrial contaminants may inhibit certain microbial processes while encouraging others. These changes affect overall greenhouse gas emissions. Constructed wetlands used for wastewater treatment demonstrate controlled gas exchange. Engineers design these systems to optimize pollutant removal while minimizing methane release. Plant selection, water flow management, and sediment control all influence outcomes. Animal respiration also contributes modestly to wetland gas flux. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, insects, and birds exchange gases with water or air. While individually small compared to microbial processes, collectively they add to ecosystem respiration. Aquatic photosynthesis counterbalances some gas release. Algae and submerged plants absorb carbon dioxide during daylight, releasing oxygen. Nighttime respiration reverses that exchange. Net balance depends on plant productivity relative to decomposition. Water chemistry affects gas solubility. Colder water dissolves more gases than warmer water. Salinity also influences solubility, meaning coastal mangrove swamps differ slightly from freshwater systems. These physical properties interact with biological processes continuously. Educational outreach increasingly includes wetland gas dynamics because climate discussions often overlook natural carbon storage systems. Highlighting wetland contributions helps inform conservation priorities. Protecting intact wetlands can reduce net greenhouse gas emissions compared to drained or degraded areas. Historical wetland drainage projects unintentionally increased atmospheric carbon dioxide by exposing peat to oxygen. Modern restoration efforts sometimes reverse those effects by re-establishing water saturation, though recovery takes time. Scientific uncertainty remains in some aspects of wetland gas flux. Microbial community diversity, temperature sensitivity, and hydrological variability introduce complexity. Continued research refines understanding, but acknowledges natural variability. Public perception often focuses on visible aspects of wetlands. Gas exchange remains largely unnoticed unless bubbles appear or odours become apparent. Yet this invisible exchange links local ecosystems to global atmospheric processes. So, beneath calm swamp water, microbes break down organic material, producing methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and other gases. These gases move upward through diffusion, bubbling, or plant transport, forming part of continuous atmospheric exchange. What looks like still water quietly participates in broader environmental cycles without drawing attention to itself. And once those chemical exchanges beneath the surface become easier to imagine, attention often shifts naturally toward the plants, thriving in these saturated conditions. Species whose unusual adaptations allow them not just to survive, but to shape the structure and chemistry of swamp environments over long periods. Plants growing in swamps deal with conditions that would quickly stress or kill many familiar terrestrial species. Constant moisture, low oxygen in soil, fluctuating water levels, unstable sediment, and periodic nutrient imbalance all shape which plants survive there. Because of those pressures, swamp vegetation often develops structural and physiological traits that look unusual compared with plants in drier environments. These adaptations are not rare exceptions in wetlands. They are the normal strategies that allow plant communities to persist where water dominates the landscape. One of the most immediately noticeable features of swamp vegetation is root structure. Earlier attention went towards submerged roots stabilizing trees, but many wetland plants also modify how roots interact with air. Some species produce hollow internal tissues known as parenchyma. These tissues create channels that move oxygen from leaves above water down into submerged roots. Without that internal airflow, roots would experience oxygen starvation in saturated soil. This adaptation appears in grasses, reeds, sedges, and even certain tree species. When cross-sections of stems are examined, the internal air spaces often resemble sponge-like cavities, clearly designed for gas movement rather than structural support alone. Mangrove trees provide particularly visible examples in coastal swamps. Their prop roots arch outward into shallow water, creating dense frameworks that stabilize shorelines. Some species develop vertical breathing roots called pneumatophores that extend above muddy surfaces. These roots contain pores allowing oxygen absorption directly from the air. Salt tolerance adds another layer of specialization. Some mangroves filter salt at root entry points, while others excrete excess salt through leaves. These physiological adjustments allow them to survive tidal fluctuations where freshwater plants would struggle. Freshwater forested swamps host their own distinctive tree adaptations. Bald cypress trees, for instance, grow characteristic knees, woody protrusions rising from submerged roots. These structures likely assist with oxygen exchange and stabilization, although research continues into their full function. Tupelo trees form buttressed bases that distribute weight across soft sediment. Such buttressing reduces the chance of toppling during storms or floods. Beyond trees, herbaceous plants dominate many wetland zones. Cattails, bulrushes, and various sedges form dense stands in shallow water. Their vertical growth keeps leaves above the surface while roots remain anchored below. These plants often reproduce through rhizomes, horizontal underground stems that spread gradually. Rhizome growth allows rapid colonization of suitable habitat while maintaining stability in soft soil. Floating plants represent another category of swamp vegetation. Water lilies, duckweed, and similar species maintain buoyancy through air-filled tissues. Their roots either dangle freely in water or anchor lightly in sediment. Floating leaves maximize sunlight exposure while minimizing competition for ground space. Some species reproduce quickly through vegetative fragmentation, covering water surfaces in favorable conditions. Carnivorous plants add further complexity. Nutrient availability in some wetlands remains low despite abundant organic matter because decomposition proceeds slowly. Plants like pitcher plants, sundews, and bladderworts supplement nutrition by trapping insects or small aquatic organisms. These plants do not rely solely on soil nutrients. Instead, they absorb nitrogen and phosphorus from captured prey. Sticky leaves, pitfall traps, or suction bladders represent different capture strategies adapted to wetland environments. Algae and microscopic aquatic plants also contribute significantly. Though less visually prominent than trees or reeds, they perform photosynthesis, producing oxygen and supporting aquatic food webs. Periphyton, communities of algae attached to submerged surfaces, coat roots, branches, and sediment. These microbial plant communities respond quickly to nutrient changes and influence water chemistry. Seasonal variation shapes plant growth patterns. Flooding periods allow aquatic plants to expand into forested zones temporarily. As waters recede, terrestrial or semi-aquatic species reclaim exposed ground. Some plants produce seeds capable of surviving submersion for extended periods. Others adjust growth rates according to water depth and duration. Reproductive strategies vary widely among swamp plants. Wind pollination works well for grasses and sedges growing in open wetland areas. Insect pollination occurs where pollinators remain active in humid environments. Water dispersal carries seeds across flooded landscapes. Buoyant seeds travel with currents until reaching suitable germination sites. Light availability influences plant distribution strongly. Dense canopy cover in forested swamps limits sunlight reaching the water surface. Shade-tolerant understory plants dominate those areas. In more open, marsh-like zones, full sunlight supports taller emergent vegetation. Floating plants compete for surface light, sometimes shading submerged species. Chemical conditions in swamp water also affect plant survival. Acidity varies depending on organic matter accumulation and water source. Some wetlands receive mineral-rich groundwater, supporting diverse plant communities. Others rely primarily on rainwater, producing more acidic conditions that favour specialised species. These chemical gradients often develop gradually across wetland landscapes. Salinity gradients shape coastal swamp vegetation. Mangroves tolerate saltwater intrusion, while freshwater species dominate inland. Transitional zones contain mixed community adapted to variable salinity. Rising sea levels influence these boundaries, shifting plant distributions over time. Water movement patterns influence root anchoring and nutrient uptake. Slow-moving water encourages sediment deposition, supporting rooted vegetation. Faster currents may favour flexible plants capable of bending without breaking. Structural flexibility becomes an important adaptation where tidal influence exists. Plant litter plays a central role in wetland nutrient cycling. Leaves falling into water decompose slowly, contributing to peat formation. Decomposition releases nutrients gradually, supporting ongoing plant growth. Some species time leaf drop to coincide with seasonal flooding, enhancing nutrient redistribution. Symbiotic relationships enhance plant survival. Mycorrhizal fungi associate with roots, increasing nutrient absorption capacity. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria supply usable nitrogen in nutrient-poor soils. These partnerships allow plants to thrive despite environmental constraints. Wetland plants also contribute to water purification. Roots absorb excess nutrients from runoff, reducing downstream pollution. Microbial communities around roots transform contaminants chemically. Constructed wetlands designed for wastewater treatment intentionally replicate these natural processes. Structural complexity created by vegetation supports animal life. Dense reeds provide nesting sites for birds. Floating plants shelter fish and amphibians. Tree roots host aquatic invertebrates. Vegetation therefore functions both as primary producer and habitat architect. Some wetland plants tolerate periodic drought. Seeds remain dormant until water returns. Rhizomes survive buried in moist soil even when surface water disappears temporarily. These resilience mechanisms allow vegetation recovery after environmental fluctuations. Human interaction with swamp plants has varied historically. Certain species provided food, fiber, medicine, or building materials. Modern conservation efforts emphasize preserving native vegetation because plant communities stabilize soil, store carbon, and support biodiversity. Invasive plant species present challenges. Non-native plants sometimes outcompete native vegetation, altering habitat structure. Examples include aggressive aquatic weeds capable of covering large water surfaces rapidly. Management strategies involve mechanical removal, biological control, or water level adjustments. Climate change influences wetland plant communities. Temperature shifts alter growing seasons. Changing rainfall patterns affect flooding cycles. Increased atmospheric carbon dioxide may enhance plant growth in some wetlands, while stressing others through altered hydrology. Scientific monitoring uses vegetation as an ecological indicator. Changes in plant species composition often signal shifts in water chemistry, hydrology, or climate. Long-term vegetation surveys help track ecosystem health. Remote sensing technologies assist vegetation mapping. Satellite imagery detects plant cover changes over large areas. Drone surveys provide detailed local assessments. These tools support conservation planning and restoration evaluation. Restoration projects frequently begin with re-establishing appropriate plant species. Hydrological correction alone may not restore ecological function without vegetation recovery. Planting native species accelerates stabilization and nutrient cycling. Educational outreach increasingly highlights unusual wetland plants to build public appreciation. Carnivorous plants, mangrove roots, and floating vegetation often attract interest because they differ visibly from familiar terrestrial flora. Increased awareness supports conservation advocacy. Wetland plants also influence microclimate. Dense vegetation reduces evaporation, moderates temperature, and increases humidity locally. These conditions benefit both plants and animals adapted to moist environments. Seed dispersal mechanisms show considerable diversity. Water currents transport buoyant seeds. Birds carry seeds externally or internally. Wind dispersal works in open wetland zones. Each method ensures colonization opportunities as environmental conditions shift. Genetic diversity within wetland plant populations contributes to resilience. Variation allows adaptation to changing conditions. Conservation strategies often aim to preserve genetic diversity alongside species diversity, so the vegetation thriving in swamps reflects a long history of adaptation to saturated soils, fluctuating water levels, limited oxygen, and nutrient complexity. Parenchyma tissues, specialized roots, carnivorous feeding strategies, floating structures, and symbiotic relationships all represent practical solutions to environmental constraints. These plants shape habitat structure, influence water chemistry, support wildlife, and contribute to carbon storage, all while often appearing still and quiet from above the waterline. And once those plant communities become easier to picture as active participants rather than passive scenery, attention naturally shifts toward how wetlands themselves function as large-scale filtration systems, gradually improving water quality through the combined action of vegetation, sediment and microbial processes. When water moves through a swamp, it rarely rushes the way it does in a river or mountain stream. Instead, it slows. Sometimes it spreads out across shallow ground, sometimes it threads through vegetation, sometimes it seeps quietly beneath the surface. That slower pace turns wetlands into highly effective natural filtration systems. Without machinery, without deliberate human engineering, swamps remove sediment, absorb nutrients, transform pollutants, and stabilize water chemistry in ways that influence entire watersheds. The simplest filtering mechanism begins with physics rather than biology. Water entering a swamp usually carries suspended particles, soil eroded from upstream land, organic debris, microscopic algae, and sometimes human-derived pollutants attached to those particles. As water velocity drops among roots, reeds, and submerged obstacles, heavier particles settle. Gravity pulls them downward. Over time, this sediment accumulation contributes to peat and mud layers discussed earlier, while simultaneously reducing turbidity in water leaving the wetland. Vegetation plays a large role in slowing water flow. Tree trunks, roots, grasses, and floating plants act as physical barriers. Even flexible plants that bend with current still reduce speed enough for particles to settle. This effect can be dramatic during flood events. Floodwaters spreading into wetlands lose momentum, depositing sediment that would otherwise travel farther downstream. Root systems do more than block flow. They absorb dissolved nutrients directly from water. Nitrogen and phosphorus, often introduced through agricultural runoff or urban drainage, become incorporated into plant tissues. Some nutrients return to water when leaves fall and decompose, but much remains stored in vegetation or sediment for extended periods. This retention reduces nutrient overload in rivers, lakes, or coastal waters. Excess nutrients downstream can trigger algal blooms that deplete oxygen when algae die and decompose. By capturing nutrients upstream, wetlands help prevent such events. This protective function often goes unnoticed, because success appears as absence of problems rather than visible change. Microbial activity amplifies filtration effectiveness. Bacteria and fungi break down organic pollutants, converting them into simpler compounds. Some microbes specialize in degrading petroleum residues, pesticides, or industrial chemicals. Others transform nitrogen compounds through nitrification and denitrification processes, eventually releasing nitrogen harmlessly as gas into the atmosphere. Denitrification deserves particular attention. Certain bacteria convert nitrate into nitrogen gas under low oxygen conditions typical of wetland sediments. This process permanently removes excess nitrogen from water, rather than simply storing it temporarily. Without wetlands, nitrate pollution would persist longer in aquatic systems, contributing to water quality degradation. Phosphorus behaves somewhat differently. It often binds to sediment particles or organic matter. As sediment settles in wetlands, phosphorus becomes trapped. Changes in oxygen levels can influence whether phosphorus remains bound or re-enters water. Stable water saturation tends to maintain retention, while disturbance or drying can release stored phosphorus. Wetlands also filter pathogens. Microbial competition, ultraviolet exposure in shallow water, and sedimentation reduce harmful microorganism concentrations. Although not a substitute for water treatment facilities, natural wetlands contribute to baseline water purification before water reaches human-managed systems. Heavy metals introduced through industrial runoff sometimes accumulate in wetland sediments. Microbial processes can change metal solubility, reducing mobility. Plants may absorb certain metals, though excessive concentrations can harm vegetation. Monitoring programs track such accumulation to assess environmental health. Organic pollutants often degrade more efficiently in wetlands than in open water. Slow water movement increases contact time between pollutants and microbes, capable of breaking them down. Root exudates supply additional organic compounds that stimulate microbial metabolism, enhancing degradation rates. Constructed wetlands deliberately replicate these natural processes. Engineers design shallow basins planted with wetland vegetation to treat wastewater. Water flows slowly through the system, allowing sedimentation, plant uptake, and microbial transformation. These systems supplement conventional treatment plants or handle stormwater runoff. Water temperature moderation occurs as well. Shaded swamp waters warm less rapidly than open channels. Cooler water holds more dissolved oxygen, benefiting aquatic organisms downstream. Temperature buffering also influences chemical reaction rates, affecting nutrient cycling and pollutant breakdown. Wetlands function as hydrological buffers. During heavy rainfall, they absorb excess water, reducing flood peaks downstream. During dry periods, stored water releases gradually, maintaining base flow in rivers. This regulation stabilizes aquatic habitats and water supply reliability. Salinity moderation happens in coastal swamps. Mangrove systems, for example, influence freshwater-saltwater mixing zones. Vegetation and sediment dynamics shape how saltwater penetrates inland, affecting agriculture and drinking water sources. Swamps also influence groundwater recharge. Slow infiltration allows water to percolate into underlying aquifers. Root channels and organic soil structure enhance permeability. Cleaned water entering groundwater supplies often has lower sediment and nutrient loads. Pollinator and wildlife support indirectly contribute to filtration. Healthy ecosystems maintain vegetation diversity, which improves nutrient uptake efficiency. Animal activity aids seed dispersal, sustaining plant communities essential for filtration processes. Public perception often overlooks these services because wetlands do not produce obvious visible output. A filtration plant shows pipes and machinery. A swamp simply exists, quietly performing similar functions over broader areas. Historical wetland drainage projects sometimes produced unintended consequences. Removing wetlands reduced natural filtration capacity, increasing downstream water treatment costs and ecological problems. Restoration efforts in some regions aim to rebuild lost filtration functions. Scientific measurement of wetland filtration involves water sampling at entry and exit points, comparing nutrient concentrations, sediment loads, and pollutant levels quantifies filtration efficiency. Results consistently show significant reductions where intact wetlands remain. Climate change introduces uncertainties. Altered rainfall patterns affect water residence time. Increased temperature may accelerate microbial processes, but also increase evaporation. Sea level rise influences coastal wetland filtration capacity. Ongoing research addresses these dynamics. Vegetation diversity enhances filtration resilience. Multiple plant species respond differently to environmental stress. Diverse communities maintain function even if some species decline. Monocultures often prove less stable under changing conditions. Soil structure plays a critical role. Organic rich soils retain water and nutrients effectively. Mineral soils may filter sediment efficiently, but store fewer nutrients. Combined soil types in wetlands create layered filtration mechanisms. Education initiatives increasingly highlight wetland filtration benefits. Community awareness supports conservation policies and sustainable land use planning. Understanding ecological services often changes attitudes toward wetland protection. Economic valuation studies estimate cost savings from natural filtration compared with engineered alternatives. Results frequently show wetlands providing substantial economic benefit. though such value rarely appears directly in markets. Biodiversity itself supports filtration. Diverse microbial communities enhance pollutant breakdown. Varied plant structures improve sediment trapping. Animal interactions sustain vegetation health. Ecological complexity underpins functional stability. Urban planning increasingly integrates wetland preservation. Stormwater management strategies incorporate natural wetlands alongside constructed systems. This approach combines ecological benefits with infrastructure efficiency. So, water entering a swamp slows, sediments settle, nutrients are absorbed, pollutants transform, pathogens decline, and hydrological stability improves. All of this occurs without obvious visual drama. The surface may look calm, but beneath it, physical, biological, and chemical processes continuously refine water quality. And once that quiet filtration role becomes clearer, attention often turns toward another surprising aspect of wetlands: their ability to preserve organic material for long periods, sometimes even archaeological remains, thanks to the same low oxygen conditions that slow decomposition in saturated soil. Wetlands do something unusual with time. While most landscapes break down organic material fairly quickly, swamps often slow that process dramatically. Waterlogged soil limits oxygen, and oxygen is one of the main drivers of rapid decay. Without it, bacteria that normally decompose plant and animal remains operate differently or more slowly. As a result, materials that would usually disappear within years can persist for centuries or longer. This preservation effect explains why swamps sometimes contain remarkably intact biological remains, archaeological artifacts, and environmental records stored layer by layer beneath the surface. Plant material provides the most widespread example. Leaves, seeds, wood fragments, and pollen grains accumulate steadily in swamp sediments. Because decomposition slows, these materials retain identifiable features far longer than in dry soil. Scientists analysing peat cores often find pollen grains from plants that grew thousands of years ago. Those pollen grains carry distinctive shapes that allow identification of past vegetation communities. By studying changes in pollen composition through sediment layers, researchers reconstruct historical climate conditions, shifts in rainfall, and ecological transitions across long periods. Wood preservation can be particularly striking. Submerged tree trunks sometimes remain intact long after surrounding forests have changed. Water saturation prevents oxygen exposure, reducing fungal decay. Minerals dissolved in water may gradually infiltrate wood tissue, increasing durability. Some preserved wood samples provide annual growth rings that reveal past environmental conditions similar to tree ring analysis on dry land. These records help scientists understand long-term climate variability. Seeds and plant fibers often survive well in peat-rich environments. Their durability helps researchers track agricultural development, plant domestication, and historical trade routes. In some cases, ancient grains recovered from wetlands show characteristics linking them to early farming cultures. Such discoveries offer insight into how human societies adapted to wetland landscapes. Animal remains also preserve differently in swamp environments. Bones may remain intact where acidic conditions are moderate, though highly acidic bogs can dissolve bone minerals while preserving soft tissue. This unusual combination has produced some of the most famous archaeological finds associated with wetlands. Human remains recovered from peat bogs, often referred to as bog bodies, illustrate this preservation effect vividly. Bog bodies discovered in northern Europe, for example, sometimes show preserved skin, hair, and even facial expressions despite being centuries or millennia old. Low oxygen, acidic water, cool temperatures, and certain plant-derived chemicals combine to inhibit bacterial decomposition, while tanning soft tissues naturally. These conditions create a preservation environment rarely found elsewhere. Archaeologists studying such remains gain insight into historical diets, clothing, health conditions, and sometimes causes of death. Analysis of stomach contents reveals last meals. Hair chemistry indicates long-term nutrition. Textile fragments preserved alongside bodies inform clothing technology and trade networks. These findings extend understanding of past societies beyond what dry archaeological sites typically provide. Artifacts unrelated to human remains also benefit from wetland preservation. Wooden tools, baskets, fishing equipment, and even small boats have been recovered from swamp sediments. On dry land, such organic materials usually decay quickly. In waterlogged conditions, they persist long enough for archaeological discovery. These artifacts help reconstruct daily life in historical wetland communities. Metal objects behave differently. Some corrode more slowly underwater due to limited oxygen. Others react chemically with organic acids present in peat. Corrosion products sometimes form protective layers that stabilize artifacts. Conservation specialists must handle such objects carefully once exposed to air because rapid oxidation can occur after excavation. Textiles preserved in wetlands offer particularly valuable information. Fibers such as wool, flax, or plant-based cloth degrade quickly in dry environments but may survive in peat. Weaving patterns, dye residues, and manufacturing techniques become accessible for study. These details inform knowledge of technological development, trade connections, and cultural practices. Environmental contaminants also leave historical records in swamp sediments. Industrial pollutants, heavy metals, and airborne particulates settle into wetlands and remain trapped in sediment layers. By analysing these layers, scientists track pollution history, industrial expansion, and environmental regulation impacts. Such data complement written historical records. Natural environmental events appear in sediment records as well. Volcanic ash layers, for instance, settle into wetlands and remain identifiable. Flood deposits create distinct sediment horizons. Fire events leave charcoal fragments. Each layer contributes to a chronological environmental archive. Preservation conditions vary among different wetland types. Acidic bogs favour soft tissue preservation but may dissolve bone. Neutral pH swamps often preserve both organic and mineral materials moderately well. Temperature, water chemistry, microbial communities, and hydrological stability all influence preservation outcomes. Excavation in wetlands requires specialised techniques. Removing preserved organic material from saturated environments exposes it to oxygen, potentially accelerating decay. Conservation processes often begin immediately after recovery. Controlled drying, chemical stabilisation, or freeze-drying methods help maintain structural integrity. Scientific dating methods rely heavily on preserved organic material. Radiocarbon dating measures carbon isotope ratios in plant fibres, wood, or bone. Wetland preservation extends the range of materials suitable for such analysis. Accurate dating supports reconstruction of environmental and cultural timelines. Wetlands also preserve DNA fragments. Ancient environmental DNA extracted from sediment reveals past species presence even without visible fossils. This technique expands understanding of historical biodiversity, migration patterns, and ecosystem change. Microfossils such as diatoms, tiny algae with silica shells, remain abundant in wetland sediments. Their species composition reflects past water conditions, including salinity, nutrient levels, and temperature. Analysing diatom assemblages helps reconstruct historical hydrology. Insects preserved in peat provide additional ecological information. Exoskeleton fragments identify species associated with specific environmental conditions. Changes in insect assemblages across sediment layers indicate climate shifts, vegetation change, or human land use. Preservation sometimes extends to footprints or trackways in waterlogged sediment that later solidifies. Such traces reveal animal presence, movement patterns, or human activity not captured through artifacts alone. Wetlands occasionally preserve entire landscapes buried by flooding or vegetation succession. Submerged forests discovered beneath modern wetlands show earlier ecological stages, These finds help track long-term environmental change beyond written history. Climate change research increasingly uses wetland sediment records. Past temperature fluctuations, precipitation patterns, and vegetation shifts appear in preserved organic material. Understanding historical variability informs projections of future environmental change. Cultural heritage management recognizes wetlands as valuable archaeological repositories. Conservation policies sometimes restrict drainage or development, precisely to protect buried artifacts. Once wetlands are drained, preservation conditions often deteriorate rapidly. Public interest in bog bodies and preserved artifacts has increased museum engagement with wetland archaeology. Exhibitions highlight preservation mechanisms alongside cultural interpretation. Educational programs emphasize environmental factors enabling such discoveries. Scientific collaboration between archaeologists, ecologists, chemists, and conservation specialists improves preservation understanding. Interdisciplinary research ensures artifacts and environmental records receive appropriate analysis and protection. Ethical considerations arise when human remains are recovered. Cultural sensitivity, legal frameworks, and descendant community involvement guide handling decisions. Respectful treatment balances scientific inquiry with cultural values. Modern pollution threatens preservation potential. Changes in water chemistry may accelerate decomposition. Drainage projects expose previously protected sediments to oxygen. Conservation strategies increasingly address these risks. Wetland restoration sometimes re-establishes preservation conditions. Reflooding drained areas slows oxidation of organic material. While not reversing past damage completely, such efforts can stabilize remaining sediments. Technological advances continue improving analysis of preserved materials. High-resolution imaging, isotopic analysis, and molecular techniques extract information without destructive sampling. These methods expand research possibilities while protecting fragile specimens. So wetlands serve not only as living ecosystems, but also as long-term environmental archives. Low oxygen, stable moisture, and specific chemical conditions allow plant material, animal remains, artifacts, and environmental indicators to persist far longer than in most terrestrial settings. These preserved materials reveal ecological history, human activity, climate patterns, and biodiversity change across centuries or millennia. And once attention settles on that capacity for long-term preservation, it becomes easier to notice how light itself interacts with swamp water and vegetation, shaping visibility, temperature, and biological behaviour in ways that influence both present-day ecosystems and the records gradually forming beneath the surface. Light behaves differently in a swamp than it does in most other landscapes, and that difference shapes nearly everything living there. It is not just a matter of brightness or darkness. It involves how sunlight enters water, how vegetation filters it, how suspended particles scatter it, and how organisms adapt their behaviour to what they can or cannot see. Visibility in wetlands often fluctuates hour by hour, season by season, and even centimetre by centimetre in the water column. These changes influence feeding patterns, plant growth, predator strategies, and overall ecosystem structure. Water itself absorbs light quickly compared with air. Even clear freshwater reduces visible light intensity with depth. Swamp water rarely qualifies as completely clear. Dissolved organic compounds from decomposing leaves, bark, and roots tint the water brown. Clay particles and fine organic debris scatter incoming sunlight. Algae and microbial growth further reduce clarity. Because of these combined effects, underwater visibility in swamps is often limited to short distances. Fish, amphibians, and invertebrates therefore rely less on long-range vision than species in clearer lakes or rivers. Tree canopy cover intensifies this effect. Many swamps support dense overhead vegetation. Branches, leaves, and vines intercept sunlight before it even reaches the water surface. What does reach the surface often arrives as diffuse filtered light rather than direct beams. This reduces temperature fluctuations but also limits photosynthesis for submerged plants. Some aquatic plants adapt by growing closer to the surface or developing floating leaves. Others tolerate low light conditions by using pigments efficient at capturing limited wavelengths. Seasonal leaf cycles alter light availability. In temperate swamps, deciduous trees shed leaves in autumn. During winter or early spring, increased sunlight reaches the water surface, stimulating growth of algae or early aquatic plants. When leaves return in warmer months, shading intensifies again. This seasonal light variation influences biological timing, including breeding cycles for certain amphibians and insects. Shadow patterns change throughout the day. Morning light enters at shallow angles, producing elongated shadows across water. Midday sunlight penetrates more directly where canopy gaps exist. Late afternoon shadows lengthen again. Animals sensitive to visual predators often adjust activity accordingly. Fish may forage more actively under shadow cover. Birds hunting visually may exploit brighter periods. Reflections also affect perception. Smooth swamp water surfaces can reflect surrounding vegetation strongly. This reflection complicates depth perception for both predators and prey. Some animals take advantage of this by remaining motionless, blending visually with reflections. Human observers often find it difficult to distinguish objects beneath the surface because reflections mask underlying detail. Light attenuation underwater follows wavelength patterns. Red wavelengths disappear quickly. Blue and green penetrate slightly farther. Organisms adapted to swamp environments sometimes show coloration, optimized for available wavelengths. Fish may display muted tones matching filtered light conditions. Bright coloration common in coral reefs rarely appears in murky freshwater wetlands. Visual signalling among animals adapts accordingly. Instead of relying heavily on colour, many swamp species emphasize movement, vibration, or sound. Frogs call loudly rather than displaying visually. Fish use lateral line sensing. Some insects rely on chemical signals. Reduced visibility shifts communication toward non-visual channels. Temperature interacts with light availability. Shaded water warms more slowly than exposed water. Cooler temperatures hold more dissolved oxygen, benefiting certain aquatic organisms. However, excessive shading may limit plant productivity. Balance between light penetration and shading shapes habitat suitability. Algae distribution reflects these conditions. Surface algae may flourish in open patches with sufficient light. Submerged algae often concentrate near edges where canopy gaps exist. Excessive shading suppresses algal growth, altering food availability for herbivorous aquatic species. Floating vegetation modifies light penetration further. Plants like water lilies or duckweed form surface mats that block sunlight. Beneath dense mats, oxygen production drops because photosynthesis decreases. Some fish species avoid heavily shaded areas for this reason. Others exploit low light conditions to evade predators. Turbidity fluctuates with rainfall and flooding. Storm runoff introduces sediment, increasing water cloudiness. As sediment settles, clarity improves gradually. These cycles influence visual hunting efficiency for predators and vulnerability for prey. Fish feeding strategies often adjust after storms. Light influences plant structure directly. Emergent wetland plants often grow tall to access unobstructed sunlight. Flexible stems allow them to sway with water movement without breaking. Leaf orientation maximizes light capture while minimizing water resistance. Photosynthetic efficiency in low light conditions involves pigment variation. Some swamp plants produce higher concentrations of chlorophyll B relative to chlorophyll A, enhancing absorption of diffused light. Accessory pigments broaden the usable light spectrum. These biochemical adjustments allow survival under dense canopy cover. Animal camouflage often reflects lighting conditions. Dark mottled coloration helps fish blend into shadowed water. Amphibians frequently display earth tones matching sediment or decaying leaves. Reptiles resting at the water surface may resemble floating debris when viewed from above. Predator-prey interactions depend heavily on visibility. Ambush predators benefit from murky water. Visual hunters may rely on sudden strikes rather than prolonged pursuit. Prey species develop rapid escape responses triggered by vibration rather than sight alone. Bird behavior also adapts. Some wading birds hunt primarily by touch, probing sediment with sensitive bills. Others rely on patient observation at water edges where clarity improves slightly. Nocturnal birds often hunt by sound rather than vision. Artificial light introduces new variables. Wetlands near urban areas experience light pollution that disrupts natural cycles. Amphibian calling behavior changes under constant illumination. Insect navigation patterns shift, affecting reproduction. Predation risk may increase if prey becomes more visible at night. Research methods account for limited visibility. Underwater cameras often require artificial lighting, which can influence animal behavior. Sonar imaging provides structural information without relying on light. Acoustic monitoring complements visual observation. Remote sensing technologies detect canopy cover and water turbidity from satellite imagery. These data help track wetland health, vegetation density, and seasonal flooding patterns. Combined with field measurements, they provide comprehensive visibility analysis. Microbial photosynthesis occurs in thin surface layers where light penetrates. Cyanobacteria contribute oxygen production in these zones. Below that, anaerobic microbial communities dominate. Vertical stratification reflects light penetration depth. Light exposure influences decomposition rates. Ultraviolet radiation can break down organic compounds in shallow water. Shaded areas rely more on microbial decomposition. This difference affects nutrient cycling speed. Seed germination in wetlands sometimes depends on light availability. Some species require direct sunlight to trigger germination. Others germinate in low-light conditions under canopy cover. Flood timing relative to light conditions affects plant recruitment success. Human recreational activities influence visibility. Boat movement stirs sediment, increasing turbidity temporarily. Construction near wetlands may alter canopy cover, changing light regimes. Such changes affect ecological balance over time. Educational programs often highlight visibility adaptation. Guided swamp tours explain why animals remain hidden and how plants cope with low light. Increased understanding reduces misconceptions about inactivity in wetlands. Climate change may alter light dynamics indirectly. Changes in vegetation patterns affect canopy density. Altered rainfall influences sediment input. Sea level rise affects water clarity in coastal wetlands. These shifts require ongoing monitoring. Water chemistry also affects light transmission. Dissolved organic carbon concentration influences coloration. Nutrient enrichment can trigger algal blooms, reducing clarity further. Balanced nutrient levels maintain moderate turbidity beneficial for certain species. So visibility in swamps reflects a combination of water chemistry, vegetation density, sediment presence, and sunlight angle. Limited light penetration shapes plant growth, animal behavior, predator-prey relationships, and microbial processes. What appears dim or obscured from above represents a stable environment adapted to specific physical conditions. And once visibility factors become clearer, attention often shifts naturally toward how animals use that reduced visibility strategically, especially predators that depend on patience and concealment rather than speed, quietly waiting within shaded water where movement remains difficult to detect. In swamp environments, movement tends to be slower, visibility is often limited, and energy conservation becomes important. These conditions shape how predators hunt. Instead of chasing prey over long distances, many swamp predators rely on patience. They remain still, sometimes almost completely motionless, waiting for opportunities rather than actively pursuing them. This approach fits the physical realities of waterlogged terrain, where rapid movement can require significant energy, and where murky water makes long-distance visual tracking difficult. Stillness itself becomes an adaptation. Reptiles like alligators or crocodiles often float with only their eyes and nostrils above the surface. From a distance, they can resemble floating logs or debris. Their coloration matches surrounding water tones, reducing contrast. By minimizing visible movement, they avoid alerting prey. Fish, birds, and mammals approaching the water edge may not detect the predator until it is already close. Fish predators show similar strategies. Species adapted to swamp conditions frequently use ambush tactics. They position themselves among submerged roots, aquatic vegetation, or sediment depressions. Because water clarity is often limited, prey species rely heavily on vibration sensing. Remaining still reduces detectable disturbance, allowing predators to remain unnoticed until the final strike. Energy efficiency explains much of this behaviour. In low oxygen water, sustained rapid swimming can be physiologically costly. Ambush predation reduces oxygen consumption compared with prolonged pursuit. Waiting quietly conserves energy while maintaining readiness. This balance between energy intake and expenditure determines survival in environments where metabolic demands must remain carefully managed. Amphibians also participate in ambush predation. Larger frogs, for instance, often remain stationary on vegetation near water surfaces. Their coloration blends with leaves or bark. When insects approach within range, a rapid tongue projection captures prey in fractions of a second. Most of the time, however, the frog remains still, minimizing detection by both prey and predators. Birds hunting in wetlands frequently adopt patient techniques as well. Herons, egrets, and similar wading birds stand motionless in shallow water, sometimes for extended periods. Their long legs allow quiet positioning without disturbing sediment excessively. Sudden movement only occurs when prey approaches within striking distance. This stillness increases hunting efficiency where visibility is limited. Snakes adapted to wetland habitats often rely on camouflage combined with immobility. Some float partially submerged. Others coil among roots or leaf litter. Visual disruption patterns on their skin help them blend into complex backgrounds. Movement remains minimal until prey comes close enough for a rapid strike. Aquatic insects exhibit comparable behaviour. Predatory beetles, water scorpions, and dragonfly larvae hide among vegetation or sediment. Their bodies often match surrounding colours. Sudden extension of mouthparts or limbs captures passing prey. Because these insects form important links in the food web, their ambush strategies influence population balance among smaller aquatic organisms. Environmental acoustics reinforce patience-based hunting. Dense vegetation absorbs sound, while water transmits vibrations effectively. Predators sensitive to vibration can detect prey movement even when visual cues are limited. This sensory adaptation allows still predators to monitor surroundings continuously without revealing their own position. Temperature stability in shaded wetlands supports prolonged immobility. Extreme temperature fluctuations might otherwise force predators to move more frequently. In swamps, moderated temperatures allow extended waiting periods without excessive metabolic cost. Reptiles especially benefit from this stability because their body temperature depends on environmental conditions. Tidal or seasonal water fluctuations introduce additional complexity. Rising water expands available hunting territory. Predators adjust positions accordingly, sometimes moving into newly flooded areas where prey disperses. When water recedes, predators concentrate in remaining channels or pools where prey density increases. These cycles influence predator distribution patterns throughout the year. Coloration patterns in swamp predators often reflect background matching rather than bright signalling. Browns, greens, muted greys, and mottled patterns dominate. Reflective surfaces such as fish scales may mimic light patterns on water. These visual adaptations reduce detectability in low-light environments. Behavioral timing also matters. Some predators hunt primarily at dawn or dusk when light conditions favour concealment. Others prefer nighttime activity, relying on non-visual senses. Amphibians and certain reptiles show increased nocturnal hunting, consistent with prey availability patterns discussed earlier. Prey species evolve counter-strategies. Enhanced lateral line sensing in fish detects subtle water movement. Amphibians develop rapid escape responses triggered by vibration. Birds maintain vigilance at water edges. These evolutionary interactions shape predator-prey dynamics over long timescales. Hydrological disturbances influence hunting success. Flood events may reduce visibility further, benefiting ambush predators. Conversely, unusually clear water may reduce camouflage effectiveness. Predators adjust behavior based on these environmental shifts. Human presence can disrupt patience-based hunting. Boat traffic, noise, or shoreline disturbance increases water movement and vibration. Predators may temporarily relocate or reduce hunting activity. Conservation guidelines often recommend minimizing disturbance in sensitive wetland habitats. Scientific observation of ambush predators requires careful methodology. Sudden human movement can alter natural behavior. Remote cameras, acoustic sensors, and long-distance observation help minimize interference. Such approaches improve understanding of predator ecology without affecting it significantly. Food web balance depends on these predators. By regulating prey populations, they prevent overconsumption of vegetation or smaller organisms. Removing top predators often leads to ecological imbalance, illustrating their importance beyond individual survival strategies. Invasive species sometimes disrupt established predator-prey relationships. Non-native predators lacking natural checks can reduce native prey populations rapidly. Conversely, introduced prey species may lack adequate predators, altering vegetation and nutrient cycles. Wetland management increasingly addresses these issues. Climate variability influences predator activity indirectly. Temperature changes affect metabolic rates. Altered rainfall patterns change water depth and habitat availability. Long-term monitoring tracks how predator distributions shift in response to environmental change. Public perception often emphasizes dramatic predator encounters. In reality, most hunting attempts in wetlands involve long periods of stillness punctuated by brief action. The majority of time, predators remain hidden, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary risk. Educational programs highlighting ambush strategies help correct misconceptions. Understanding patience as a survival adaptation fosters appreciation rather than fear. It also illustrates broader ecological principles of energy efficiency and environmental adaptation. So, in swamp environments, still water often hosts predators that depend on concealment, reduced movement, and sensory awareness rather than speed. Reptiles float quietly, fish wait among roots, amphibians remain poised near vegetation, birds stand motionless in shallow water, and aquatic insects hide within sediment. Patience becomes not merely a behavioral choice, but a practical response to environmental constraints. And once predator behavior becomes easier to picture within those shaded, low-visibility waters, it becomes natural to consider how seasonal shifts, flooding and drying cycles reshape these habitats repeatedly, influencing where animals and plants move and how ecological relationships adjust over time. Swamps rarely remain exactly the same from one month to the next, even though they can appear visually stable when observed casually. Water levels rise and fall, vegetation responds to shifting moisture, animal populations adjust their behavior, and chemical processes inside soil and water fluctuate with temperature and rainfall. These seasonal cycles are not disturbances in the sense of disruption. They are expected patterns that shape how swamp ecosystems function over time. Floods, dry spells, temperature changes, and variations in daylight all contribute to a repeating rhythm that supports renewal rather than decline. Flooding is often the most noticeable seasonal event in many swamp systems. Heavy rainfall, snowmelt upstream, or tidal influence in coastal wetlands can raise water levels significantly. Areas that were previously exposed soil become submerged. Channels expand into surrounding forest. Aquatic plants gain new territory temporarily, and fish disperse into flooded vegetation. This expansion creates access to food sources such as insects, fallen fruit, and organic debris previously unavailable underwater. For fish, seasonal flooding can be essential for reproduction. Many species spawn during rising water periods because expanded habitat provides shelter for eggs and juveniles. Newly flooded areas often contain abundant organic material, supporting microbial growth that feeds invertebrates, which in turn feed young fish. This chain of productivity depends on flood timing aligning with reproductive cycles. Amphibians also benefit from temporary flooding. Seasonal pools formed by rising water often lack large fish predators, making them safer breeding grounds for frogs and salamanders. Eggs deposited in these ephemeral waters can develop with reduced predation risk. As water levels drop later, juveniles disperse into surrounding habitats. Bird populations respond visibly to seasonal water shifts. Wading birds move into newly flooded zones where prey becomes accessible. Migratory birds use wetlands as stopover points during seasonal travel. Nesting behaviour often aligns with periods of stable water levels that reduce nest flooding risk while ensuring food availability. Vegetation shows clear responses as well. Some swamp plants tolerate prolonged submersion and grow vigorously during flood periods. Others survive by producing seeds capable of withstanding inundation. Floating plants may expand rapidly when water depth increases. Root systems adapted to fluctuating water levels help maintain plant stability. Floodwaters also transport nutrients. Sediment carried from upstream regions settles among roots and vegetation as water slows. This deposition enriches soil fertility gradually. Nutrient input supports plant growth without requiring external fertilization. Over time, repeated flood cycles maintain productivity even in nutrient-poor environments. When floodwaters recede, a different phase begins. Exposed soil allows oxygen to penetrate upper sediment layers. Microbial decomposition may accelerate briefly. Nutrients stored in organic matter become available for plant uptake. Some species germinate specifically during these drier intervals before water returns. Dry periods, whether seasonal drought or short-term low rainfall phases, influence animal movement. Fish retreat to deeper channels or permanent pools. Amphibians seek moist refuges under vegetation or in burrows. Reptiles adjust basking behaviour according to water availability. Insects with aquatic larval stages may enter dormant phases until water returns. Plant adaptations to drought vary. Some wetland species maintain dormant underground rhizomes capable of surviving temporary dryness. Seeds with protective coatings resist desiccation. Woody plants with deeper roots access groundwater when surface water declines. These strategies ensure vegetation recovery once conditions improve. Temperature cycles interact with water levels. Warmer seasons increase evaporation rates. Cooler seasons reduce evaporation and may bring increased precipitation depending on regional climate patterns. Temperature also affects microbial metabolism, influencing nutrient cycling speed and gas production. Ice formation occurs in colder climates. Frozen surfaces limit gas exchange temporarily and reduce biological activity near the surface. However, deeper water and sediment remain unfrozen, allowing some processes to continue. Spring thaw re-establishes normal exchange patterns and often triggers increased biological activity. Light availability shifts seasonally with sun angle and canopy leaf cycles. Increased sunlight in early spring supports aquatic plant growth before tree leaves fully develop. Dense summer foliage reduces light penetration again. These changes affect photosynthesis, oxygen production, and food web dynamics. Salinity fluctuations affect coastal swamps. Seasonal rainfall dilutes saltwater intrusion, while dry periods allow greater salinity penetration inland. Mangrove vegetation tolerates these shifts, but freshwater species may retreat during higher salinity phases. These gradients influence species distribution patterns. Hydrological variability maintains habitat diversity. Permanently flooded zones coexist with seasonally flooded areas and periodically dry patches. This mosaic supports different species simultaneously. Biodiversity often increases where multiple habitat types overlap within a wetland system. Animal life cycles frequently synchronize with seasonal patterns. Insect emergence events align with temperature and water conditions. Amphibian breeding corresponds with rainfall. Bird migration follows seasonal food availability. Such timing reflects long evolutionary adaptation to predictable environmental rhythms. Human water management sometimes alters natural cycles. Dams, drainage projects, or water diversion can reduce seasonal flooding. These changes affect nutrient transport, fish reproduction, plant distribution, and sediment deposition. Restoration efforts often aim to re-establish more natural hydrological variability. Climate change introduces uncertainty into seasonal patterns. Altered rainfall timing, increased extreme weather events, and temperature shifts may disrupt established ecological rhythms. Monitoring long-term trends helps predict how wetlands will respond. Scientific study of seasonal wetland dynamics involves continuous monitoring. Water level gauges, temperature sensors, nutrient sampling, and wildlife surveys provide data across years. Long-term data sets reveal patterns not visible in short-term observation. Floodplain connectivity remains important for wetland health. Maintaining links between rivers and adjacent swamps allows natural flood pulses. Barriers that isolate wetlands reduce nutrient exchange and biodiversity support. Community engagement in wetland conservation increasingly emphasizes seasonal awareness. Educational programs highlight how flooding and drying cycles benefit ecosystems rather than representing problems alone. Understanding natural variability supports informed land use decisions. Cultural traditions in some regions align with wetland seasonal cycles. Fishing, harvesting, or ceremonial activities historically followed flood timing. These practices reflect long-standing recognition of environmental rhythms. So seasonal change in swamps involves more than fluctuating water depth. Floods bring nutrients, expand habitat, and support reproduction. Dry periods introduce oxygen, stimulate decomposition, and trigger plant regeneration. Temperature and light cycles shape biological activity. Together, these factors create continuous renewal, ensuring ecosystem resilience over time. And once those seasonal rhythms become easier to recognize, it often becomes interesting to consider how humans have historically interpreted wetlands culturally. Sometimes with caution or misunderstanding, sometimes with respect, shaping myths, stories, and perceptions that still influence how swamps are viewed today. Human reactions to swamps have rarely been neutral. Across different regions and historical periods, wetlands have inspired caution, practical respect, curiosity, economic interest, and sometimes exaggerated fear. Much of that response developed long before scientific ecology existed, when people depended directly on landscapes for survival and interpreted unfamiliar environments through storytelling. Swamps, with their dense vegetation, shifting ground, insects, and reduced visibility, naturally encouraged imaginative explanations. Those cultural interpretations still shape how wetlands are viewed today, even though modern research has clarified many of their ecological roles. Early agricultural societies often regarded swamps as difficult land. Waterlogged soil complicates farming using traditional methods. Mosquitoes and waterborne diseases posed real risks before modern medicine. Travel through wetlands required extra effort because firm ground was unpredictable. These practical challenges contributed to reputations of swamps as inconvenient or unhealthy places. Cultural memory preserved those experiences in stories that emphasized caution. In many European traditions, wetlands became associated with uncertainty. Folklore sometimes described mysterious lights over marshes, often called will-o'-the-wisps. Today, these lights are usually explained as natural gas emissions, particularly methane and phosphine compounds that can ignite or reflect light under certain conditions. Historically, however, such phenomena were interpreted as spirits, tricksters, or warnings to travellers. These interpretations reflected attempts to make sense of unfamiliar environmental processes using available cultural frameworks. North American swamp imagery developed somewhat differently. Indigenous communities often understood wetlands as productive environments rich in fish, edible plants, and wildlife. Traditional ecological knowledge included seasonal harvesting strategies adapted to flood cycles. Later European settlers sometimes retained older fears, while also recognizing economic potential for timber, trapping, and agriculture once drainage technologies improved. Cultural perceptions therefore mixed respect with caution. Tropical swamp regions developed their own narrative traditions. Mangrove forests, river deltas, and equatorial wetlands frequently supported dense biodiversity, but also presented navigation challenges. Local communities developed detailed knowledge of tides, plant species, and wildlife behaviour. Stories reflecting this knowledge often emphasize practical survival rather than supernatural fear, though mythological elements still appeared in oral traditions. Literature played a strong role in shaping public perception. Adventure novels, travel accounts, and later films often portrayed swamps as mysterious or dangerous settings. Dense vegetation created dramatic visual backdrops. Limited visibility supported suspense narratives. Wildlife unfamiliar to urban audiences enhanced the sense of exoticism. These portrayals sometimes overshadowed more accurate ecological understanding. Cinema reinforced similar imagery. Swamps frequently appeared as locations for suspense or survival stories. Cinematic lighting emphasized shadow and reflection, reinforcing impressions of secrecy. While visually effective, such portrayals often neglected ecological accuracy. Over time, repeated exposure to these representations influenced public attitudes even among people with little direct wetland experience. At the same time, fascination with wetlands grew among naturalists and scientists. Early ecological studies revealed biodiversity richness previously overlooked. Observations of migratory birds, amphibian breeding patterns, and aquatic plant diversity demonstrated ecological value beyond earlier assumptions. Scientific exploration gradually replaced mystery with measurable understanding. Artistic representation evolved as well. Landscape painters began depicting wetlands not simply as obstacles, but as dynamic ecosystems. Photography brought detailed documentation of plant structures, wildlife behaviour, and seasonal changes. These visual records helped shift perception from fear toward appreciation. Language reflects cultural attitudes. Terms like swampy, bogged down, or marshy situation often carry negative connotations implying difficulty or stagnation. Such metaphors originate from physical experience but extend into abstract language. Awareness of ecological importance has prompted some reconsideration of these associations, though linguistic habits change slowly. Public health developments altered perception significantly. Control of mosquito-borne diseases through improved sanitation, medical advances and ecological management reduced fear linked to illness. Wetland management strategies now emphasize ecological balance rather than complete drainage, recognizing predator species that naturally regulate mosquito populations. Economic interests also influenced attitudes. Peat harvesting, timber extraction, fisheries, and tourism all drew attention to wetland resources. Economic valuation sometimes promoted conservation by demonstrating practical benefits. In other cases, resource exploitation led to wetland degradation before ecological consequences became widely understood. Tourism introduced a different type of fascination. Guided swamp tours, wildlife observation, and ecotourism initiatives allowed people to experience wetlands safely. Direct observation often replaced inherited fears with curiosity. Educational interpretation helped visitors understand ecological functions previously overlooked. Mythological themes persist in modern storytelling, though often with environmental awareness incorporated. Contemporary documentaries highlight biodiversity, carbon storage, and water purification roles alongside cultural history. This blended approach acknowledges both traditional narratives and scientific knowledge. Indigenous ecological knowledge continues contributing to modern understanding. Long-term observation embedded in cultural practice often aligns with scientific findings regarding seasonal cycles, species behaviour, and sustainable resource use. Collaboration between scientists and indigenous communities increasingly informs wetland conservation strategies. Urbanisation has changed public exposure to wetlands. Many people now encounter swamps primarily through media rather than direct experience. This distance can perpetuate outdated perceptions unless balanced by education. Wetland restoration projects near urban areas sometimes include public access precisely to bridge that gap. Environmental education programs increasingly emphasize experiential learning. Boardwalk trails, visitor centres, and citizen science initiatives encourage direct engagement. Observing bird migration, amphibian breeding, or plant diversity firsthand often shifts perception from apprehension toward interest. Climate discussions have introduced wetlands into broader public awareness. Recognition of carbon storage capacity highlights global importance beyond local cultural narratives. This scientific framing adds practical urgency to conservation conversations. Policy development reflects changing attitudes. Earlier drainage projects aim to eliminate wetlands. Modern policies often prioritize preservation, restoration, and sustainable management. Legal protections for wetlands exist in many countries, though enforcement varies. Media coverage influences perception continually. News reports on flooding, wildlife encounters, or environmental protection shape public opinion. Balanced reporting that includes ecological context supports informed understanding. Educational curricula increasingly include wetland ecology. Students learn about nutrient cycling, biodiversity, and climate connections alongside historical cultural interpretations. Early education helps counter persistent misconceptions. Artistic interest remains strong. Writers, photographers, and filmmakers continue exploring wetland themes. Contemporary work often emphasizes ecological realism alongside aesthetic appreciation. This shift reflects broader cultural change. Community-based conservation projects demonstrate practical engagement. Local volunteers participate in habitat restoration, wildlife monitoring, and educational outreach. Active involvement often transforms perception from distant curiosity to personal investment. Scientific outreach efforts highlight wetland ecosystem services in accessible language, explaining water filtration, flood control, and carbon storage in practical terms helps connect ecological function to everyday life. Cultural festivals in some regions celebrate wetlands through food, music, and traditional practices. These events reinforce positive associations and encourage stewardship. Despite increased awareness, lingering fears sometimes persist, often rooted in historical experience or media portrayal. Addressing these concerns respectfully rather than dismissively supports constructive dialogue. Technological advances allow virtual exploration of wetlands through documentaries, interactive maps, and remote sensing imagery. While not replacing direct experience, these tools expand accessibility. Conservation messaging increasingly emphasizes coexistence rather than separation. Understanding predator behavior, insect ecology, and plant adaptation reduces unnecessary alarm while promoting safety awareness. Economic valuation studies show wetlands providing flood mitigation, water purification, and tourism revenue. Presenting these benefits in financial terms complements ecological arguments. Global collaboration on wetland conservation occurs through international agreements and research networks. Shared knowledge supports consistent management approaches across regions. Cultural heritage preservation intersects with ecological protection. Archaeological sites within wetlands require maintaining waterlogged conditions for continued preservation, linking environmental management with historical conservation. Educational storytelling that integrates scientific accuracy with cultural context proves particularly effective. It respects traditional narratives while providing updated understanding. Changing climate patterns highlight wetland resilience but also vulnerability. Public awareness of these dynamics encourages proactive conservation planning. So human imagination has shaped swamp perception through myth, literature, practical experience, economic interest and scientific discovery. Fear, fascination, respect, and curiosity have all played roles. Modern understanding increasingly emphasizes ecological value while acknowledging historical narratives that influenced earlier attitudes. And as attention shifts from cultural perception back toward ecological function, the connection between wetlands and global climate processes becomes especially relevant, particularly the role swamps play in storing carbon and influencing atmospheric chemistry over long periods. Swamps connect to the global climate system in ways that are not immediately obvious when looking at still water, dense vegetation, or muddy ground. The connection mostly comes down to carbon, how it moves through ecosystems, how long it stays stored, and how it eventually returns to the atmosphere. Carbon cycles constantly between air, water, soil, plants, and living organisms. Wetlands influence that cycle strongly because they slow decomposition and trap organic material. That means they function both as carbon reservoirs and as sources of certain greenhouse gases, depending on environmental conditions. Plants growing in swamps absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis just like plants anywhere else. Leaves, stems, roots, and reproductive structures all contain carbon captured from air. When those plants die, much of that carbon does not immediately return to the atmosphere. Instead, it falls into waterlogged soil where oxygen is limited. Because oxygen supports rapid decomposition, its absence slows microbial breakdown. Organic matter accumulates gradually, forming peat, organic mud, or similar deposits discussed earlier. That accumulated material represents carbon that has been effectively stored outside the atmosphere. This storage process can last a very long time. Some peat deposits date back thousands of years. Even relatively young wetland soils may hold decades or centuries of carbon accumulation. Compared with dry forests, grasslands, or agricultural land, wetlands often store more carbon per unit area in soil rather than in living vegetation. That distinction matters because soil carbon tends to remain stable longer than carbon in leaves or wood that eventually decompose. However, storage is only one side of the balance. Microbial processes continue even in low oxygen environments. Instead of releasing carbon dioxide exclusively, anaerobic microbes often produce methane. Methane forms when specialized microorganisms break down organic compounds without oxygen. This gas eventually escapes into the atmosphere through bubbling, diffusion, or transport through plant tissues. Methane has stronger short-term warming potential than carbon dioxide, so wetlands become both carbon sinks and methane sources simultaneously. Understanding the net climate impact requires evaluating both processes together. A wetland storing large amounts of carbon while emitting smaller amounts of methane may still provide overall climate benefits. If conditions change, such as drainage exposing peat to oxygen, decomposition accelerates dramatically. Stored carbon converts to carbon dioxide relatively quickly. In that scenario, a former carbon sink becomes a carbon source. Human land use changes have influenced this balance significantly. Drainage projects historically aim to convert wetlands into farmland or development sites. Lowering water levels introduced oxygen into peat soils. Rapid decomposition followed, releasing stored carbon accumulated over centuries. Some regions experience soil subsidence as organic matter oxidized and soil volume decreased. These outcomes illustrate how sensitive wetland carbon storage is to hydrological stability. Restoration efforts attempt to reverse those trends by re-establishing water saturation. Reflooding drained wetlands slows decomposition again, though recovery takes time. Existing carbon losses cannot be reversed immediately, but future accumulation can resume. Monitoring restored wetlands helps determine how quickly carbon storage functions recover. Climate variability interacts with wetland carbon cycling continuously. Temperature influences microbial metabolism. Warmer conditions generally accelerate decomposition, increasing both carbon dioxide and methane production. Changes in precipitation alter water levels, affecting oxygen availability in soil. Drought periods expose peat to air, while heavy rainfall maintains saturation. These fluctuations influence yearly greenhouse gas balances. Vegetation type also affects carbon storage efficiency. Forested swamps with woody vegetation contribute different organic matter composition compared with grassy marshes or moss-dominated bogs. Woody material decomposes more slowly due to lignin content. Moss-dominated systems, particularly sphagnum bogs, create acidic conditions that further inhibit decomposition. Each wetland type therefore interacts differently with climate processes. Root systems influence carbon dynamics beyond structural stabilization. Roots exude organic compounds into soil, feeding microbial communities. They also transport oxygen downward through parenchyma tissues, creating localized aerobic zones within otherwise anaerobic sediment. These microzones influence which microbial processes dominate, affecting greenhouse gas production rates. Fire adds another variable. Waterlogged wetlands typically resist fire, but prolonged drought can dry surface peat layers. When peat ignites, fires may smolder underground for extended periods, releasing large amounts of carbon. Such events are difficult to extinguish because flames may not appear above ground while combustion continues below. Climate-induced drought increases this risk in certain regions. Permafrost wetlands in high latitudes introduce additional complexity. Frozen ground preserves organic material similarly to water saturation. As temperatures rise, thawing permafrost exposes previously frozen carbon to decomposition. Wetland formation sometimes follows thawing, creating new methane-emitting environments, while also allowing future carbon accumulation. Sea level rise affects coastal swamps, especially mangrove ecosystems. Rising water levels can expand wetland area in some cases, increasing carbon storage potential. In other situations, rapid sea level rise outpaces vegetation adaptation, leading to wetland loss. Sediment supply, tidal dynamics, and coastal development influence outcomes. Wetlands also influence climate indirectly through water vapor exchange. Evapotranspiration from wetland vegetation adds moisture to the atmosphere. Increased atmospheric moisture can affect local precipitation patterns and temperature regulation. While less discussed than carbon exchange, this hydrological influence contributes to regional climate dynamics. Cloud formation sometimes links to wetland moisture flux. Increased humidity near extensive wetlands can enhance cloud development under suitable atmospheric conditions. Cloud cover then influences temperature by reflecting solar radiation or trapping heat depending on cloud type and altitude. Biodiversity connections matter as well. Diverse plant communities often store carbon more effectively due to varied growth forms and root structures. Animal activity contributes to nutrient cycling that supports plant productivity. Healthy ecosystems maintain balanced carbon uptake and storage more consistently than degraded ones. Agricultural runoff entering wetlands influences carbon cycling. Excess nutrients stimulate plant growth initially, potentially increasing carbon uptake. Over time, nutrient imbalance may alter species composition or accelerate decomposition, reducing long-term storage stability. Management practices increasingly aim to reduce nutrient input. Urban expansion sometimes reduces wetland area directly through filling or indirectly through altered hydrology. Stormwater management increasingly incorporates wetland preservation to maintain both flood control and carbon storage functions. Integrated planning recognizes multiple ecosystem services simultaneously. Scientific measurement of wetland carbon exchange involves several methods. Gas flux chambers placed on soil or water surfaces capture emitted gases for analysis. Eddy covariance towers measure atmospheric gas movement continuously over larger areas. Satellite observation track vegetation productivity and wetland extent globally. Combining these approaches improves accuracy. Long-term data sets reveal trends not visible in short-term studies. Year-to-year variability can be substantial due to weather fluctuations. Multi-decade monitoring clarifies whether wetlands function as net carbon sinks or sources over time. Policy frameworks increasingly incorporate wetland conservation into climate mitigation strategies. Protecting existing wetlands prevents carbon release from disturbance. Restoration projects aim to enhance future storage capacity. International climate agreements sometimes include wetland management recommendations. Economic valuation studies attempt to quantify climate benefits of wetlands. Estimating carbon storage in financial terms supports policy decisions. While assigning monetary value to ecological processes remains complex, such analyses help integrate environmental considerations into planning. Public awareness of wetland climate roles has grown gradually. Early environmental messaging focused on wildlife habitat and flood control. Climate discussions now emphasize carbon storage and greenhouse gas regulation. This broader understanding supports conservation support. Educational outreach often uses accessible comparisons. Explaining that wetland soils can store more carbon than forests of similar size helps illustrate significance. Demonstrating how drainage releases stored carbon clarifies consequences of land use decisions. Technological advances improve modelling accuracy. Climate models increasingly incorporate wetland carbon dynamics explicitly, rather than treating wetlands as minor components. Better representation improves future climate projections. Local community involvement enhances conservation success. Residents participating in wetland monitoring, restoration planting, or educational programs often develop stronger stewardship commitment. Community-based approaches complement scientific management. Wetland conservation intersects with food security as well. Fisheries supported by wetlands contribute protein sources. Flood regulation protects agricultural land. Climate stabilization indirectly supports crop productivity. Global distribution of wetlands varies widely. Tropical regions host extensive mangrove and freshwater swamp systems. Boreal regions contain peatlands storing large carbon quantities. Temperate wetlands provide important migratory bird habitat alongside climate functions. Each region contributes differently to global carbon balance. International collaboration supports data sharing and conservation strategies. Wetlands cross political boundaries through river systems, coastal zones, and migratory species routes. Coordinated management improves effectiveness. Scientific uncertainty remains regarding precise methane emission responses to future climate change. Temperature sensitivity, hydrological shifts, and vegetation changes interact in complex ways. Continued research aims to refine predictions. Technological monitoring increasingly includes automated sensors capable of continuous measurement. Data streams from remote wetlands inform global models in near real time. Improved spatial coverage enhances understanding. Restoration design increasingly considers carbon outcomes explicitly. Water level targets, plant species selection, and sediment management influence greenhouse gas balance. Adaptive management allows adjustment based on monitoring results. Public communication emphasizes practical relevance, highlighting flood prevention, water purification, wildlife habitat, and climate regulation together demonstrates multiple benefits of wetland conservation. So swamps connect to global climate through carbon capture, long-term storage in saturated soils, methane production during anaerobic decomposition, water vapour exchange influencing atmospheric processes, and biodiversity interactions affecting ecosystem productivity. These connections operate continuously even when wetlands appear visually quiet. What seems like still water and dense vegetation participates actively in planetary-scale environmental cycles. And once that climate role becomes easier to picture, attention naturally shifts toward the sensory experience of being in a swamp itself. The sounds, smells, humidity, and subtle atmospheric qualities that people notice directly even before understanding the larger ecological processes at work. Being in a swamp involves more than what can be seen. Even before noticing plants, water levels, or wildlife, most people become aware of sensory details. Sound behaves differently there. Air feels heavier. Smells are often present, sometimes subtle, sometimes more noticeable depending on weather and season. Humidity affects how skin feels, how breathing feels, even how clothing sits against the body. These sensory elements shape human perception of wetlands just as much as ecological knowledge does. Understanding them helps explain why swamps can seem unfamiliar or distinctive compared with other landscapes. Sound is usually the first change people notice. Open environments allow sound to travel freely with fewer obstructions. Swamps often contain dense vegetation, irregular ground surfaces, and water bodies that absorb or reflect sound differently. Trees, reeds, and shrubs break up sound waves, reducing echoes. Water surfaces reflect certain frequencies while absorbing others. As a result, sound sometimes seems muted or diffuse rather than sharply directional. Insects contribute a constant acoustic background in many wetlands. Rather than isolated buzzing, the sound becomes a steady layer. Mosquitoes, midges, crickets, and other insects produce overlapping frequencies that blend into continuous noise. This effect may seem loud initially, but often fades into background awareness after prolonged exposure. The brain adjusts, treating it as environmental baseline rather than active stimulus. Amphibian calls, particularly frogs, often dominate evening soundscapes. Different species produce distinct calls with specific rhythms and pitches. Because sound reflects off water surfaces, these calls sometimes seem closer or farther than they actually are. Multiple individuals calling simultaneously create layered acoustics that experienced listeners can distinguish, even when beginners perceive only general noise. Bird vocalizations vary by time of day. Dawn often brings increased activity as birds establish territory or coordinate group behavior. Some wetland birds call while hidden in vegetation, making location difficult to determine. Waterfowl movement produces splashes and wing sounds that carry differently across humid air. Humidity itself influences sound transmission. Moist air carries sound more efficiently than dry air. High humidity reduces sound attenuation, allowing certain frequencies to travel farther. Combined with dense vegetation, this creates complex acoustic environments where some sounds carry unexpectedly far while others fade quickly. Wind behaves differently as well. Dense vegetation reduces airflow speed at ground level. Light breezes may barely register under tree canopy, even when stronger winds occur nearby. When wind does move through wetland vegetation, it often produces rustling sounds softer than those in dry forests, because leaves contain higher moisture content. Smell represents another noticeable aspect of swamp environments. Organic decomposition produces gases such as methane, hydrogen sulfide, and various volatile organic compounds. These gases often remain at low concentrations, creating mild earthy or slightly sulfur-like odours. The smell intensity varies with temperature, water level, and microbial activity. Decomposing plant material contributes tannin-rich compounds to water. These compounds sometimes produce a scent reminiscent of damp leaves or forest floor. Many people associate this smell with natural environments generally, though it may be more pronounced in wetlands due to constant moisture. Not all wetland odours indicate decay. Flowering plants, algae blooms, and microbial activity each produce distinct scents. Some aquatic plants release fragrances noticeable only at close range. Seasonal changes influence which scents dominate at different times. Temperature perception also differs in swamps. Water bodies moderate temperature extremes. During hot weather, shaded wetland areas may feel cooler than open land. Conversely, high humidity can reduce evaporative cooling from skin, making warmth feel more intense despite similar air temperatures. Humidity affects breathing sensations subtly. Moist air often feels heavier even when oxygen levels remain normal. Some people notice condensation forming on skin or clothing more quickly. Glasses may fog when moving between open land and wetland interiors due to humidity differences. Ground texture contributes to sensory experience. Soft soil, mud, or peat compress underfoot differently from dry ground. Movement requires attention to footing. Sounds of walking may be quieter because soft surfaces absorb impact. This reduction in footstep noise sometimes enhances awareness of other environmental sounds. Light quality interacts with atmosphere as well. Moist air scatters light differently than dry air. Sunlight filtering through canopy and humidity sometimes creates diffuse illumination. Shadows appear softer. Colours may seem muted compared with dry, open landscapes. Visual contrast often decreases slightly in humid conditions. Haze can develop even at short distances. Combined with vegetation density, this reduces long-range visibility. Many animals adapt to these conditions by relying on senses other than vision, as discussed earlier. Insect presence affects sensory awareness. Even when not biting, their movement near ears or skin can increase alertness. Over time, people often adapt, becoming less reactive as familiarity increases. Protective clothing or repellents reduce discomfort while allowing observation. Water sounds themselves vary. Gentle dripping from vegetation after rain, subtle ripples from fish, or occasional splashes contribute to background acoustics. These sounds often lack regular rhythm, creating a natural but unpredictable auditory environment. Nighttime atmosphere differs noticeably from daytime conditions. Temperature drops slightly. Humidity often increases further. Sound carries differently in cooler evening air. Amphibian choruses intensify. Light reduction heightens reliance on hearing and smell. Seasonal variation shapes sensory conditions. Spring flooding increases water surface area, affecting humidity and sound reflection. Summer warmth intensifies biological activity and associated scents. Autumn leaf fall adds organic material to water, altering smell and water colour. Winter conditions in temperate regions reduce insect noise and may introduce ice-related sounds. Human-made noise behaves differently in wetlands. Engine sounds from distant boats or vehicles may carry across water surfaces. Construction near wetlands can alter acoustic environments significantly. Conservation planning sometimes considers noise pollution effects on wildlife. Air quality in wetlands is generally good, especially away from urban sources. Vegetation absorbs pollutants and releases oxygen through photosynthesis. However, stagnant air under dense canopy occasionally concentrates natural odours temporarily. Personal perception varies widely. Some people find wetland sounds calming. Others interpret them as unfamiliar or unsettling initially. Familiarity often shifts interpretation toward appreciation. Educational exposure helps people recognize ecological meaning behind sensory cues. Cultural associations influence sensory interpretation. Literature and media sometimes emphasize mysterious or ominous swamp atmospheres. Direct experience often reveals more neutral or even pleasant sensory conditions than expected. Scientific research sometimes uses sensory cues as indicators. Odor changes can signal altered microbial activity. Soundscape analysis tracks biodiversity. Temperature and humidity measurements inform ecological modelling. Human sensory perception sometimes aligns with measurable environmental variables. Recreation and tourism depend partly on sensory appeal. Birdwatching, photography, and nature observation benefit from distinctive wetland atmosphere. Boardwalks and observation platforms allow safe access while minimizing ecological disturbance. Health considerations include insect protection, hydration in humid conditions, and awareness of uneven terrain. Proper preparation enhances comfort and safety during wetland visits, so the sensory experience of swamps combines layered soundscapes, subtle natural odours, moderated temperature, high humidity, diffuse light, and soft ground texture. These factors influence perception immediately, often before ecological understanding develops. What feels unfamiliar initially often reflects physical environmental conditions rather than danger or instability, and once that sensory dimension becomes clearer, attention often turns toward the broader question of why wetlands matter at all beyond personal experience, especially their ecological importance, biodiversity support, and contributions to environmental stability on regional and global scales. Swamps often exist on the edge of public attention. People may pass by them, see them on maps, or hear about them during flood seasons, but they are rarely the first landscapes that come to mind when thinking about environmental importance. Forests, oceans, mountains, and deserts usually receive more recognition. Yet wetlands, including swamps, quietly support environmental stability in ways that extend far beyond their visible boundaries. Their importance emerges through water regulation, biodiversity support, climate influence, soil stability, and long-term ecological resilience. Water management represents one of the most practical functions. Swamps naturally absorb excess water during heavy rainfall or river overflow. Their saturated soils, dense vegetation, and uneven ground slow incoming water, reducing flood peaks downstream. This buffering effect protects communities, agriculture, and infrastructure. Without wetlands, floodwaters often move faster and cause more extensive damage. Many modern flood control strategies now incorporate wetland preservation precisely because engineered systems alone may not replicate these natural functions effectively. Water purification adds another layer of significance. As water passes through wetlands, sediment settles, nutrients are absorbed, and pollutants undergo microbial transformation. Nitrogen compounds convert into atmospheric nitrogen through denitrification. Phosphorus binds to sediment or organic matter. Organic pollutants break down gradually. The result is cleaner water entering rivers, lakes, or coastal areas. This natural filtration reduces the burden on water treatment facilities and improves aquatic ecosystem health. Biodiversity support is another critical aspect. Swamps host diverse plant and animal species adapted specifically to waterlogged conditions. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, insects, and microorganisms all find habitat there. Many species depend on wetlands for at least part of their life cycle, particularly breeding or feeding stages. Migratory birds rely on wetlands as stopover points. Amphibians often require shallow water for egg development. Fish may use floodplain swamps as nurseries. Protecting wetlands therefore supports broader biodiversity networks extending far beyond wetland boundaries. Plant diversity within swamps contributes to ecosystem stability. Different plant species occupy slightly different niches based on water depth, soil chemistry, and light availability. This diversity spreads ecological risk. If environmental conditions change, some species decline while others adapt, maintaining overall ecosystem function. Monoculture landscapes rarely provide similar resilience. Carbon storage connects wetlands to climate stability. Saturated soils slow decomposition, allowing organic material to accumulate. This stored carbon remains out of the atmosphere as long as water levels remain stable. Disturbing wetlands through drainage or development releases that carbon. Preserving wetlands therefore supports climate mitigation alongside biodiversity conservation. Soil stability deserves attention as well. Root systems in swamp vegetation bind sediment, reducing erosion. During storms or high water events, stabilised soil prevents excessive sediment transport downstream. Coastal mangrove swamps provide especially strong shoreline protection, reducing wave energy and storm surge impact. Inland wetlands similarly reduce riverbank erosion. Wetlands also influence groundwater recharge. Slow water movement allows infiltration into underlying aquifers. This process supports drinking water supplies, agricultural irrigation, and ecosystem sustainability. Water entering groundwater through wetlands often carries fewer pollutants due to filtration processes already discussed. Food resources link wetlands to human livelihoods. Fisheries depend on wetland nursery habitats. Certain edible plants grow in swamp environments. Traditional communities often harvest resources sustainably based on seasonal knowledge. Maintaining wetland health supports food security indirectly through these connections. Pollinator support represents another less obvious benefit. Many wetland plants rely on insects for pollination. These insects may also pollinate agricultural crops nearby. Habitat continuity supports pollinator population stability, contributing to agricultural productivity. Disease regulation also connects to ecological balance. Healthy wetlands host predator species that naturally control mosquito populations. Birds, bats, fish, and insects all participate in this regulation. Eliminating wetlands sometimes increases mosquito problems rather than reducing them because natural predators disappear. Cultural significance varies globally. Some communities hold wetlands as sacred landscapes. Others incorporate them into traditional livelihoods, art, or storytelling. Cultural heritage preservation often intersects with environmental conservation, particularly where archaeological remains remain preserved in peat-rich environments. Educational value continues to grow. Wetlands provide accessible examples of ecological principles such as nutrient cycling, food webs, hydrology, and climate interactions. Field education programs often use wetlands to demonstrate ecosystem complexity in a relatively compact area. Scientific research benefits from wetland study because these environments integrate biological, chemical, and physical processes closely. Insights gained from wetland research inform broader ecological understanding, including climate science, conservation biology, and environmental engineering. Urban planning increasingly recognizes wetland benefits. Preserving wetlands within or near cities reduces flood risk, improves water quality, and provides recreational green space. Constructed wetlands sometimes supplement natural ones to manage stormwater effectively. Economic valuation studies attempt to quantify wetland ecosystem services. Flood protection, water purification, carbon storage, tourism, and fisheries support all have measurable economic impacts. Although assigning precise monetary value remains challenging, studies consistently show wetlands providing significant cost savings compared with engineered alternatives alone. Wetland loss historically occurred through drainage for agriculture, urban expansion, or industrial development. Awareness of ecological consequences has led to stronger conservation policies in many regions. Restoration projects aim to recover lost functions, though full recovery often requires long time frames. Climate adaptation strategies increasingly incorporate wetlands. Rising sea levels, changing precipitation patterns, and increased storm intensity all highlight the need for natural buffering systems. Wetlands provide adaptable, self-regulating responses that complement engineered infrastructure. Public perception continues evolving. Earlier views often emphasized inconvenience or health concerns. Modern ecological understanding highlights benefits alongside manageable risks. Education, direct experience, and scientific communication contribute to this shift. Technological advances support conservation monitoring. Satellite imagery tracks wetland extent globally. Sensor networks measure water quality and gas exchange. Citizen science programs contribute observational data. Integrated information improves management decisions. policy frameworks increasingly include wetland protection within broader environmental agreements. International cooperation recognises wetlands as transboundary resources influencing global climate, biodiversity and water systems. Biodiversity conservation efforts often prioritise wetlands because they support disproportionate species richness relative to area. Protecting wetlands therefore contributes efficiently to global conservation goals. Community engagement plays a central role. Local stewardship programs, restoration volunteering, and educational outreach strengthen long-term conservation success. People directly involved in wetland protection often develop stronger appreciation for their value. Technological innovation sometimes mimics wetland processes. Wastewater treatment wetlands, green infrastructure, and floodplain restoration all draw inspiration from natural systems. Learning from wetlands improves engineering solutions, so swamps matter not only because of what lives within them, but because of how they influence surrounding environments. They regulate water flow, filter pollutants, store carbon, support biodiversity, stabilise soil, contribute to climate balance, and provide cultural and economic benefits. Much of this work occurs quietly without dramatic visual signals, which explains why their importance sometimes goes underappreciated. And once those broader ecological contributions become clearer, it becomes easier to shift attention toward a more reflective perspective, considering how still water, layered sediment and slow ecological processes connect to long-term environmental stability and the calm continuity wetlands represent over time. By now, the image of a swamp usually looks different than it did at the beginning. What once might have seemed like quiet water and dense vegetation begins to resolve into something more structured. Layers of activity continue even when movement is not obvious. Roots stabilise soft ground. Microbes recycle organic material continuously. Fish, amphibians, insects, birds, and reptiles adjust their behaviour to visibility, temperature, and seasonal water levels. Plants filter water, store carbon, and shape habitat at the same time. All of this unfolds gradually without urgency, which is why it often escapes casual notice. Still water does not indicate inactivity, it often indicates balance. Fast-moving environments tend to draw attention because change is visible immediately. Swamps operate differently. Processes unfold slowly. Sediment accumulates millimetre by millimetre. Vegetation spreads gradually. Microbial communities adjust continuously to subtle chemical shifts. Seasonal flooding repeats patterns that have occurred for generations. That steadiness supports resilience. Systems built on gradual adjustment often absorb disturbance more effectively than those depending on rapid change. Time behaves differently in wetlands compared with environments shaped mainly by erosion or fast water flow. Organic material accumulates rather than washing away quickly. Soil layers retain records of past conditions. Pollen trapped decades or centuries ago remains identifiable. Chemical signatures reveal environmental change. Archaeological artifacts sometimes persist where they would otherwise decay. This layering turns wetlands into environmental archives without deliberate human design. Carbon storage adds another dimension to that sense of extended time. Plants capture atmospheric carbon through photosynthesis. When those plants die in saturated soil, decomposition slows. Carbon remains locked in sediment instead of returning immediately to the atmosphere. The result connects local ecological stability with global climate processes. Quiet accumulation in one location contributes to atmospheric balance, far beyond the wetland itself. Hydrological stability works similarly. Wetlands buffer floods not through sudden dramatic intervention, but through consistent absorption and release of water. Soil composition, vegetation density, and root structure combine to slow water movement. This function reduces downstream flooding risk and maintains stream flow during dry periods. Communities benefiting from this regulation may never notice the wetland performing it unless the wetland disappears. Water filtration continues in the same understated way. nutrients entering from agriculture, urban runoff, or natural erosion encounter vegetation and microbial communities capable of transforming or storing them. Sediment settles. Pollutants degrade gradually. Water leaving the wetland carries fewer suspended particles and lower nutrient concentrations. This purification rarely draws attention precisely because it prevents visible problems from developing. Biodiversity thrives under these steady conditions. Species adapted to wetlands depend on predictable cycles rather than constant rapid change. Amphibians rely on seasonal flooding. Fish depend on stable low oxygen conditions they have evolved to tolerate. Plants adapt to saturated soil through specialized root structures. Removing or drastically altering wetlands disrupts these relationships quickly because they developed over long time scales. Human perception often focuses on immediacy. Environments that change rapidly or produce obvious visual effects capture attention more easily. Wetlands challenge that tendency. Their contributions accumulate slowly. Their value often becomes most visible only when they are lost. Increased flooding, reduced water quality, biodiversity decline, and carbon release frequently follow wetland removal. Recognition of these consequences has driven modern conservation efforts. Cultural perception continues evolving alongside scientific understanding. Earlier generations sometimes viewed swamps primarily as obstacles or sources of disease. Advances in ecology, medicine, and environmental management reframed those perspectives. Today, wetlands are increasingly recognized as infrastructure supporting environmental stability. This shift reflects improved knowledge rather than any change in the wetlands themselves. Technological monitoring reinforces this awareness. Satellite imagery tracks wetland extent globally. Gas flux sensors measure greenhouse gas exchange. Water quality instruments detect nutrient transformation. Acoustic monitoring records biodiversity patterns. Data collected over decades confirm the long-term stability wetlands provide despite surface stillness. Education plays an important role in perception change. Direct experience through guided visits, documentaries, or field studies helps people recognize subtle activity. Observing bird migration, amphibian breeding, or plant adaptation firsthand often replaces inherited assumptions with informed understanding. Familiarity reduces uncertainty while increasing appreciation. Urban planning increasingly integrates wetland preservation for practical reasons. Flood mitigation, stormwater management, green space provision, and water purification all benefit from intact wetlands. Constructed wetlands sometimes replicate these functions where natural systems have been lost, demonstrating how engineering now learns from ecological processes rather than attempting to replace them entirely. Climate discussions further emphasize wetland importance. Carbon storage capacity, methane production balance, and hydrological buffering all influence global environmental stability. Protecting wetlands becomes part of broader climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. Restoration projects seek not only biodiversity recovery but also long-term climate benefits. Local community involvement strengthens conservation outcomes. Residents participating in monitoring, restoration planting, or educational outreach often develop stronger connection to nearby wetlands. Stewardship rooted in familiarity tends to persist longer than policies imposed without community engagement. Economic evaluation increasingly recognizes ecosystem services wetlands provide. Flood protection, water purification, tourism, fisheries support, and carbon storage all carry measurable value. Although assigning precise monetary figures remains complex, economic analysis supports policy decisions that might otherwise overlook ecological contributions. Scientific uncertainty remains in certain areas, particularly regarding future climate responses. Temperature shifts, precipitation variability, and sea level rise all affect wetland dynamics. Continued research helps refine understanding, but variability is expected. Adaptive management strategies allow adjustment as new data emerge. Despite that uncertainty, one consistent observation persists. Wetlands function most effectively when hydrological stability remains intact. Sudden drainage, pollution, or physical disruption often produces rapid ecological change. Gradual adaptation works best when environmental conditions change slowly. Personal experience of wetlands often reflects this steadiness. Sounds blend into continuous background. Air feels humid but stable. Visual movement occurs subtly rather than dramatically. This sensory environment encourages slower observation. People spending extended time in wetlands often report noticing details that would be missed in faster-paced settings. Wildlife behaviour reinforces that impression. Predators rely on patience rather than pursuit. Fish conserve energy in low-oxygen water. Amphibians synchronize breeding with seasonal cycles. Plants grow steadily within environmental constraints. Microbes operate continuously regardless of visible activity. Each component contributes to an ecosystem defined more by persistence than by sudden change. Historical records preserved in wetland sediments extend that perspective further. Environmental change becomes visible across decades or centuries rather than days. Pollen layers, chemical signatures, preserved wood, and archaeological remains collectively illustrate long-term continuity. These records help contextualize modern environmental change within longer timelines. Technological capacity to study wetlands continues improving. Environmental DNA sampling identifies species presence from water samples. Automated sensors track chemical conditions continuously. Remote sensing maps vegetation shifts. These tools enhance understanding while minimizing disturbance. Public awareness grows gradually alongside these advances. Documentaries, educational programs, and community projects bring wetland ecology into wider conversation. Increased familiarity supports conservation support and responsible land use planning. The broader environmental lesson remains practical. Systems functioning quietly over long periods often provide stability precisely because they avoid extremes. Wetlands' moderate water flow, store carbon, support biodiversity, and filter pollutants without constant intervention. Recognizing that steadiness encourages management approaches focused on preservation rather than constant modification. As attention settles on that idea, the image of still water takes on a different meaning. It reflects ongoing biological activity, chemical transformation, and ecological balance rather than inactivity. Beneath the surface, roots grow, microbes recycle nutrients, gases exchange with the atmosphere, animals move cautiously, and sediment layers record environmental history. None of it requires dramatic motion to remain effective, and that quiet continuity tends to remain in place whether anyone observes it or not, with wetlands continuing their gradual work across seasons, years, and generations, maintaining ecological stability through processes that rarely demand attention, yet consistently shape the environment surrounding them.